This first-class seat must be a mistake. Someone like you belongs in the back of the plane. The words sliced through the bustling cacophony of Gate B-24 at JFK International Airport, sharp and deliberate as a surgeon's knife. They were delivered by flight attendant Morgan Taylor with a dismissive flick of her wrist toward Dr. Gabrielle Reynolds, who stood motionless, her carry-on bag resting beside her sensible shoes. Have you ever been judged by your appearance rather than your credentials? Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. Because this story of power prejudice and justice at 30,000 feet will resonate with anyone who's ever been underestimated. The departure lounge for Atlantic SkyLine Flight AS847 to Los Angeles was a microcosm of modern travel. Harried business travelers hunched over laptops, families corralling excited children, couples sharing earbuds. But in that moment, as Morgan's words hung in the air, a peculiar stillness descended on the immediate vicinity. A few passengers glanced up, then quickly away, pretending they hadn't heard the naked contempt in the flight attendant's voice. Dr. Reynolds didn't flinch. Her expression remained impassive, a practiced neutrality born from decades of similar encounters. The woman before her saw only what she expected to see. A 52-year-old black woman in comfortable travel clothes, clearly out of place among the premium cabin passengers with their designer luggage and tailored suits. What Morgan Taylor couldn't see, was that she had just insulted the recently appointed director of the Federal Aviation Administration, the singular person with the authority to ground entire airlines for safety violations. The woman whose signature appeared on the flight credentials of every pilot, flight attendant, and air traffic controller in American skies. The woman who would in exactly 27 hours launch the most comprehensive safety investigation in Atlantic SkyLine's history. But that reckoning lay ahead. For now, Dr. Gabrielle Reynolds simply adjusted the strap of her leather carry-on, met Morgan's condescending gaze, and replied with a voice as calm as still water. I believe there's been a misunderstanding. My boarding pass clearly indicates seat 2A. And so began the chain of events that would transform not just one airline, but an entire industry's approach to both safety and dignity. A transformation that started with the fateful decision to move Dr. Reynolds to seat 38B, the worst seat on the plane. Dr. Gabrielle Reynolds hadn't planned to travel incognito. She simply dressed as herself, the woman beyond the title, beyond the power suits and formal photographs that adorned the FAA headquarters. Today, she wore a navy cardigan over a simple blouse, dark slacks, and comfortable flats. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in an elegant but unfussy twist, and her only jewelry was a pair of pearl earrings and her late mother's wedding band. She had booked this personal trip months ago, a rare weekend away from the crushing responsibilities of overseeing America's aviation safety infrastructure. Her niece, Zoe, was graduating with honors from UCLA's aerospace engineering program, the third generation of Reynolds women to pursue a career in aviation. Gabrielle wouldn't miss it for the world. At 52, Dr. Reynolds carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had broken barriers her entire life. The daughter of a Tuskegee airman and a mathematics professor, excellence had never been optional in her household. She had earned her engineering degree from MIT, followed by a PhD in aviation safety systems. Her career had taken her from NASA to the NTSB, and finally to the pinnacle of aviation regulation. But today's journey was not about Dr. Reynolds, the FAA director. It was about Aunt Gabby, who had promised to take her niece to dinner at that little seafood place in Santa Monica they both loved. As she stood at gate B-24, Gabrielle briefly reflected on the patterns that had repeated throughout her professional life. At 28, she had been mistaken for an administrative assistant during her first day as a senior safety engineer. At 35, security had stopped her entering the executive floor of her own agency, despite the ID badge clearly displayed on her lapel. At 41, a flight attendant had directed her to the economy line while she was traveling on official government business in first class. Each time she had responded not with outrage, but with methodical documentation. Each incident had been noted, reported, and added to her growing understanding of how bias operated in the systems she was committed to reforming. Her approach wasn't passive, it was strategic. She played the long game because the long game was where true change happened. You learn to watch, to listen, and to remember, her father had told her. The moment you lose your temper is the moment they stop seeing you and start seeing a stereotype. Your power is in your patience. His words had shaped her professional philosophy. She didn't need to announce her authority. She embodied it through competence, precision, and an unwavering commitment to making American skies the safest in the world. As Dr. Reynolds presented her boarding pass to be scanned, she had no intention of pulling rank or revealing her position. She was simply a passenger with a confirmed first-class seat on Flight AS847, looking forward to celebrating her niece's achievement. Little did she know that this routine flight would become a watershed moment, not just for her, but for an entire industry's reckoning with its hidden biases and dangerous shortcuts. Allison Peterson didn't look up when Dr. Reynolds approached the priority boarding lane. The gate agent's fingers flew across the keyboard with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had processed thousands of passengers with the same robotic greeting. Boarding pass and ID. Allison said the words running together into a single practiced sound. Dr. Reynolds placed her passport and phone displaying her digital boarding pass on the counter. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice warm despite the agent's coldness. Allison finally looked up, her eyes performing a quick dismissive assessment. Her gaze lingered on Dr. Reynolds' simple attire, the absence of visible designer labels, the practical carry-on. Something shifted in her expression, a subtle tightening around her mouth, a slight narrowing of her eyes. One moment she said, her tone noticeably cooler than it had been with the businessman who had just passed through. She tapped aggressively at her keyboard, her French manicured nails clicking like tiny hammers. The screen flickered with information only Allison could see. She frowned, then typed again, her movements increasingly performative. "There appears to be a problem with your seat assignment," Allison announced, not looking at Dr. Reynolds, but at the screen, as if the computer itself held more authority than the passenger before her. Dr. Reynolds maintained her composed demeanor. "A problem. I booked seat 2A several months ago and confirmed my check-in this morning." Her voice remained measured and reasonable, the same voice that had calmly guided emergency congressional hearings and international safety summits. "The system is showing an equipment change." Allison recited, her tone rehearsed and hollow. "Our seating configuration is different. Your original seat is unavailable." Dr. Reynolds knew this excuse well. An equipment change, the swapping of one aircraft type for another, could legitimately affect seating arrangements. But it was also the go-to explanation when gate agents needed to move passengers for reasons they preferred not to disclose. "I understand that equipment changes happen," Dr. Reynolds acknowledged. "In that case, I'm sure you can find me a comparable seat in the forward cabin." Allison's blue eyes, cold and devoid of any desire to be helpful, finally met Dr. Reynolds' gaze. "All we have is what the system gives me," she said with finality. "I need you to step aside for a moment. I have other passengers to board. I'll see what I can do." It wasn't a request. It was a command, a dismissal. Dr. Reynolds felt the familiar prickle of awareness that she was experiencing yet another incident for her mental file. "Of course," she said with a slight nod, stepping to the designated waiting area. From this position, she had a clear view of the boarding process. She watched as Allison processed a dozen other first-class passengers with smiles and cheerful directions. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Wilson." "Have a wonderful trip, Ms. Thornton." "Your seat is ready for you, Mr. Daniels." Then she noticed something curious. A man in an expensive but rumpled suit approached the counter. He was in his early 50s with the ruddy complexion of someone who enjoyed expense account lunches and premium spirits. Allison's professional mask slipped into something more familiar as he leaned across the counter. They spoke briefly, their heads close together. Dr. Reynolds couldn't hear their exchange, but she clearly saw the man, whose name tag identified him as R. Whitman from Atlas Financial, slip a folded piece of paper across the counter. Allison palmed it smoothly, then tapped something into her computer with a smile that transformed her entire demeanor. Dr. Reynolds stood for 15 minutes, a pillar of patience amidst the swirling tide of travelers. Families with crying children, anxious business travelers, and excited tourists all flowed past her through the gate and down the jet bridge. She was rendered invisible, a problem to be dealt with later. She used the time to observe her professional mind cataloging Allison's interactions, noting patterns in who received prompt service and who was made to wait. She paid particular attention to the boarding scanner, which displayed a green confirmation light for valid boarding passes, the same confirmation light that had appeared when her own pass was scanned before this mysterious problem arose. This wasn't just poor customer service. It was a targeted slight, a petty abuse of power that she recognized all too well. The storm was gathering, but for now it was contained within the quiet, observant mind of the most powerful woman in American aviation. The final boarding call echoed through the terminal, a digital trumpet signaling the imminent departure. The once teeming gate area had thinned to a few stragglers gathering their belongings. Only then did Allison Peterson deign to acknowledge Dr. Reynolds' existence again. She gestured with an impatient flick of her wrist, not even bothering to call Dr. Reynolds by name. Dr. Reynolds walked back to the podium, her expression unreadable. She maintained a deliberate calm, refusing to give Allison the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. "All right, I found something for you," Allison said, her voice laced with the condescending magnanimity of someone bestowing a great favor. She began printing a new boarding pass. The cheap, flimsy paper spooled out of the machine with a high-pitched whine. "Is it a seat in first class?" Dr. Reynolds asked, already knowing the answer. Allison didn't respond immediately. She tore the boarding pass from the printer with a flourish and slapped it onto the counter. "This is your new seat 38B. You'll need to board now or you'll miss the flight." Dr. Reynolds looked down at the ticket. 38B, a middle seat in the very last row of the aircraft. The humiliation was as stark and deliberate as a slap in the face. It wasn't a comparable seat. It wasn't even a decent seat in economy. It was the worst possible seat on the plane, a non-reclining sliver of space wedged between two strangers right next to the noise and smell of the lavatories. This was no equipment change. This was a message. She picked up the boarding pass and held it next to her phone, which still displayed her original 2A ticket. "Ms. Peterson," Dr. Reynolds said, her voice dropping to a lower, more serious register. "I paid for a first-class ticket. This is a middle seat in the last row. There seems to be a significant misunderstanding." Allison leaned forward, bracing her hands on the counter. The pretense of customer service was gone, replaced by undisguised hostility. "There's no misunderstanding. The flight is full. It's this seat, or you can wait for the next flight, which isn't until tomorrow morning. Your choice, but you need to make it now." She glanced pointedly at the gate door where another agent was waiting to close it. The subtext was clear. People like you should be grateful to be on the plane at all. For a fleeting moment, Dr. Reynolds considered her options. She could reveal her identity right here, right now. She could make one phone call and have Allison's supervisor, the station manager, and possibly the airline's vice president scrambling to this gate within minutes. The ensuing chaos would be spectacular, but that would mean turning her personal trip into a public incident and potentially overshadowing her niece's special day. More importantly, it would solve the immediate problem for her, but it wouldn't expose the deeper issues she was now witnessing. A single gate agent might get a slap on the wrist. But what if the problem was more pervasive? A calm observation would yield far more valuable data than an immediate intervention. She would see this through from the perspective of an ordinary passenger, She would experience Atlantic SkyLine's culture firsthand. With a resolve that settled over her like a cloak of ice, Dr. Reynolds made her decision. She tucked the new offensive boarding pass into her handbag, alongside her original ticket. She gave Allison a long, steady look, a look that held no anger, only a profound and chilling sense of appraisal. Allison Peterson. Today at 2:17 p.m. Gate B24. This moment will be remembered. Dr. Reynolds said, her voice even but penetrating. The direct use of her name seemed to rattle Allison for a second. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face before the mask of arrogance slammed back into place. "Board the plane," she snapped, turning away to busy herself with paperwork, the discussion now officially over in her mind. As Dr. Reynolds walked down the jet bridge, she felt a weight of purpose settling over her. This was no longer just a personal trip. It had become something else entirely. An opportunity to witness firsthand the true culture of an airline when they thought no one with power was watching. Stepping onto the aircraft felt like crossing into enemy territory. The air inside was cool and sterile, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. At the entrance, 2 flight attendants stood guard. The senior of the two, the woman who had insulted Dr. Reynolds at the gate, wore a name tag that read Morgan Taylor. Her harsh dark lipstick and rigid posture projected an air of unyielding authority. "Welcome aboard, Atlantic SkyLine." Morgan said the words a hollow formality. Her eyes immediately dropped to the boarding pass in Dr. Reynolds' hand, noting the seat number 38B. Her lips curled into a smug little smile. As Dr. Reynolds moved into the aisle, she had to pause as other passengers stowed their luggage. Her original seat 2A was directly to her left. Richard Whitman, the businessman from the gate, was settling into it already, kicking off his shoes and accepting a pre-departure glass of champagne from another attendant. He caught Dr. Reynolds' eye, a flicker of recognition in his. He was the man who had been speaking conspiratorially with Allison at the gate. He raised his glass to her with a triumphant smirk before turning his attention to the in-flight magazine. The puzzle pieces clicked into place. This wasn't an overbooking. It was a backroom deal, a cheap upgrade for a frequent complainer, or corporate connection facilitated by removing the one passenger Allison felt she could bully without consequence. Dr. Reynolds' jaw tightened imperceptibly, but she pressed on, beginning the long, humiliating walk of shame down the length of the plane. It felt like a gauntlet. The wide plush seats and generous legroom of first class gave way to the slightly less generous business class, and then to the cramped 3-3 configuration of economy. Every passenger she passed seemed to be watching her, their faces a mixture of pity and indifference. A young woman tapping on her phone looked up briefly, then quickly away. An older man in a cardigan offered a sympathetic smile. A mother trying to settle a fussy child didn't notice her at all, absorbed in her own travel challenges. As she navigated the narrow aisle, Morgan Taylor followed a few paces behind, ostensibly to manage the cabin, but clearly to shadow her. When Dr. Reynolds paused to let someone pass, Morgan's voice cut through the air behind her. "Ma'am, you need to keep moving. We can't block the aisle. Your seat is at the very back." The emphasis on very was dripping with scorn. Dr. Reynolds ignored her and continued her journey. The faces blurred as she moved deeper into the aircraft. The overhead bins became more crowded, the air slightly warmer, the seats visibly less comfortable. The back of the plane was a different world from the front, a physical manifestation of the class divide that separated first class from economy. Finally, she arrived at row 38. It was even worse than she had imagined. The seats were narrower, the legroom non-existent, and the proximity to the 2 lavatories created a constant flow of traffic and a faint, unpleasant chemical odor. Her seat 38B was a veritable prison of cheap upholstery wedged between a large man who had already spilled over the armrest and a nervous young woman who was clutching a travel pillow to her chest. "Excuse me," Dr. Reynolds said politely to the young woman, who quickly unbuckled and stood to let her in. Squeezing into the middle seat, Dr. Reynolds stowed her small bag under the seat in front of her and buckled her seatbelt. The confines of the seat pressed in on her from all sides. To her right, the man's arm dominated the armrest. To her left, the young woman was trying to make herself as small as possible, perhaps sensing Dr. Reynolds' discomfort. The indignity of the situation wasn't lost on her. From a spacious first-class seat with priority service to this cramped, uncomfortable space at the back of the plane, the transition was designed to humiliate to put her in her place. But they had made a critical miscalculation. This seat, this vantage point, gave her a perspective on Atlantic SkyLine's operations that she would never have had from the isolated luxury of first class. From here, she could see everything. And what she would see over the next 5 hours would change the airline forever. After squeezing into her seat and stowing her small bag, Dr. Reynolds decided to make one final official attempt to resolve the situation on board. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood waiting for Morgan to pass by. When the flight attendant appeared, Dr. Reynolds flagged her down politely. "Excuse me, I need to speak with you for a moment." Morgan stopped, crossing her arms defensively. "The seatbelt sign is on, ma'am. You need to be seated." "I will in a moment," Dr. Reynolds replied calmly. "I was the passenger moved from seat 2A. I have my original first-class ticket right here. I'm requesting that you rectify the gate agent's error." She held up her phone, showing the pristine digital pass for 2A. Morgan didn't even glance at it. Her face was a mask of practiced indifference. "Gate decisions are final," she said, her voice loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "We have no control over seating assignments once the door is closed. Now please sit down. You are delaying our departure." "This isn't a simple assignment issue," Dr. Reynolds pressed, keeping her voice low and professional. "It's a matter of a ticket I paid for and the service I was denied." Her calm demeanor only seemed to enrage Morgan further, who interpreted it as a challenge to her authority. "Look," Morgan hissed, leaning in close. "I don't know what kind of trouble you caused at the gate, but it ends here. You have a seat and you should be happy with it. One more word and I'll have the captain come back here. Do you want me to get the captain?" It was a blatant threat designed to intimidate and silence. The man in the aisle seat stared resolutely ahead, pretending not to hear. The young woman by the window shrank further into her seat. In that moment, Dr. Reynolds was completely isolated. A junior flight attendant, a young woman named Elena Rodriguez, according to her name tag, was watching the exchange from the galley, her face pale with discomfort. She looked away as soon as she caught Dr. Reynolds' eye, too new or too scared to intervene. Defeated for the moment, Dr. Reynolds sat down. The humiliation burned hot in her chest, but on the surface she was a placid lake. She had given them every opportunity to correct their error. Now she would document their failures. The cabin doors closed with a final sealing thud. The engines began to whine. She was trapped for the next 5 hours. But so were they. Morgan and her crew thought they had won. They thought they had put a difficult passenger in her place. What they had actually done was lock themselves in a steel tube 30,000 feet in the air with their industry's chief regulator. And the audit had just begun. As Flight AS847 taxied toward the runway, Dr. Reynolds took a deep, centering breath. She felt the weight of her government phone in her bag, a direct line to the highest levels of aviation authority. She would not use it. Not yet. First, she would observe. She would document. She would give Atlantic SkyLine enough rope to hang themselves, because this wasn't about a seat anymore. This was about safety, about accountability, about ensuring that an airline that treated passengers with such contempt wasn't cutting corners on matters of life and death. In 5 hours, she thought to herself as the aircraft lifted off, they'll wish they had never heard of Seat 38B. As Flight AS847 ascended through the clouds leaving the New York skyline behind, a profound shift occurred within Dr. Gabrielle Reynolds. The sting of personal humiliation receded, replaced by the cold, analytical mindset of the FAA director. Her personal trip had just become a field observation. The cabin of this airplane was now a microcosm, a case study in the culture of Atlantic SkyLine Airlines. She wasn't just a wronged passenger anymore. She was a federal official witnessing potential regulatory failures in real time. Dr. Reynolds settled into her cramped middle seat and made a conscious decision she wouldn't read her book or watch a movie. Instead, she would observe. Her senses were heightened, her mind a silent recorder noting every detail with forensic precision. The role felt familiar. Early in her career at the NTSB, she had learned that the most valuable insights often came not from official inspections, where everyone was on their best behavior, but from anonymous observations when no one thought they were being watched. The true character of an operation reveals itself when it thinks no one who matters is looking, her first mentor had told her. Those words had shaped her approach to regulation throughout her career. Now wedged uncomfortably between two strangers, Dr. Reynolds began to mentally organize her observations into categories: service standards, crew, behavior, safety compliance, and passenger treatment. Each incident would be categorized, time-stamped, and connected to specific regulations in the comprehensive FAA code she knew by heart. She thought briefly of her father, who had faced much worse indignities than a downgraded airline seat. He had flown combat missions for a country that wouldn't serve him at certain lunch counters. Yet he had maintained his dignity through it all, turning his experiences into fuel for change rather than bitterness. When they underestimate you, he used to tell her, they give you their power. Atlantic SkyLine had just handed her an enormous amount of power. They just didn't know it yet. The personal insult of being moved to seat 38B was now irrelevant. What mattered was what that action revealed about the airline's culture. Did a company that would arbitrarily punish a passenger based on appearance also take shortcuts with maintenance checks? Did flight attendants who threatened passengers over minor issues also neglect crucial safety procedures? The link between how a company treated its passengers and how it approached safety wasn't just theoretical to Dr. Reynolds. It was backed by decades of accident investigation data. Airlines with toxic service cultures often had corresponding lapses in safety protocols. The attitude that allowed Morgan to threaten a passenger for standing up was connected to the mindset that might allow a mechanic to sign off on an incomplete inspection. As the aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude, Dr. Reynolds took out a small notepad. To a casual observer, she appeared to be jotting down thoughts or making a to-do list. In reality, she was creating a detailed timeline of everything she had observed so far, with particular attention to the regulatory implications. This wasn't about revenge. This was about responsibility. Her position as FAA director wasn't just a title. It was a sacred trust. The safety of millions of travelers depended on her willingness to identify and address failures in the system, whether they were technical failures or human ones. By the time the seatbelt sign dinged off, Dr. Gabrielle Reynolds had fully transitioned from wronged passenger to federal regulator. Her eyes missed nothing. Her memory recorded everything. And her determination to hold Atlantic SkyLine accountable had crystallized into an unshakable resolve. The audit had begun. The first infraction was minor but telling. During the initial beverage service, Morgan and another flight attendant worked the front of the economy cabin. Their service was perfunctory, their smiles thin and forced. When a passenger in row 25 politely asked for a full can of soda, Morgan rolled her eyes and said, "We only give out cups. It's policy," before moving on without another word. Yet minutes later, Dr. Reynolds watched as the same attendant discreetly passed 2 full cans to a handsome man in row 15 with a wink. The policy was arbitrary, a tool to be applied or ignored based on whim. Dr. Reynolds noted the inconsistency along with the time and seat numbers. It wasn't a safety violation, but it was a clear indicator of a troubling culture, one where rules existed not as standards to be upheld, but as weapons to be wielded selectively. As the service cart moved slowly down the aisle, Dr. Reynolds observed a pattern emerging. Younger, attractive passengers received warmer treatment. Business travelers in crisp attire were offered extra snacks without asking. Families with children were rushed through service with barely concealed impatience. Elderly passengers' requests were frequently forgotten until they asked again. When the cart finally reached row 38, Morgan barely glanced at Dr. Reynolds as she slapped a plastic cup of ice onto her tray table. "What would you like?" she asked, her voice flat and disinterested. "Water, please," Dr. Reynolds replied. Morgan poured a splash of water over the ice, handed her a napkin, and immediately turned to the next passenger without waiting to see if she needed anything else. The contrast was stark. Just a few minutes earlier, Dr. Reynolds had observed Morgan chatting amicably with a middle-aged white businessman about local restaurants in Los Angeles. The transformation from engaged hospitality professional to cold automaton was instant and clearly intentional. But the disparities went beyond mere rudeness. Dr. Reynolds noticed that call buttons from the rear of the aircraft were routinely ignored. An elderly Asian man 3 rows ahead pressed his button needing assistance to reach the lavatory. The light remained illuminated for nearly 10 minutes while Morgan and another crew member scrolled through their phones in the galley, clearly visible and deliberately ignoring the summons. Finally, Elena Rodriguez, the junior flight attendant, noticed and hurried to help the man, offering him a steady arm and a kind word. The older man thanked her profusely as she helped him navigate the narrow aisle. Dr. Reynolds made note of the incident. Call button response times weren't just about service. They were a critical safety function. In a medical emergency, those minutes of deliberate inattention could mean the difference between life and death. She continued her observations, watching how language barriers were treated with impatience rather than assistance, how certain accents received curt responses, while others garnered friendly banter. The pattern was undeniable. There was a clear hierarchy of perceived value among the passengers, and it had nothing to do with the class of service they had purchased. It was based on appearance, age, race, and the crew's subjective assessment of status. This wasn't just poor customer service. It was a broader failure of leadership and training, one that created an environment where arbitrary treatment was normalized and accountability was absent. As she sipped her rapidly diluting water, Dr. Reynolds wondered how deep the problem went. If Atlantic SkyLine allowed this level of visible dysfunction in customer interactions, what was happening behind the scenes in the maintenance hangars and safety briefings where passengers couldn't see? The beverage service concluded, but her documentation continued. Each incident alone might seem minor, a rolled eye, a forgotten request, an arbitrary rule. But together they formed a mosaic of a broken culture, one where employees felt empowered to discriminate without consequences. And in Dr. Reynolds' extensive experience, airlines that couldn't manage the visible rarely mastered the invisible. The true test was yet to come. Then the turbulence hit. A sudden jarring shudder shook the aircraft, causing the captain to switch on the seatbelt sign and make a calm announcement for passengers and crew to take their seats. Dr. Reynolds instinctively looked toward the galley. The service cart was still in the aisle unattended. Morgan, who had been chatting with a colleague, slowly and grudgingly began to push it back toward the galley. She failed to properly latch it into its storage bay before sitting down. During the next big jolt, the heavy cart rolled out several feet, its unsecured metal drawers rattling ominously before it was stopped by the quick action of Elena, the junior attendant, who rushed to secure it properly. Dr. Reynolds' blood ran cold. An unsecured service cart in moderate turbulence could become a 200-pound projectile. It was a serious safety breach, a direct violation of FAA regulations. It was laziness that could have led to severe injury or worse. She noted the time, the approximate location, and the names of the crew involved. This wasn't a service issue anymore. This was a clear safety violation that put every passenger on the aircraft at risk. As the turbulence continued, Dr. Reynolds noticed more disturbing details. The passenger briefing cards in her row were for an entirely different aircraft type, a Boeing 737 rather than the Airbus A320 they were currently flying. The emergency exit row across from her had no briefing at all. The flight attendants had rushed through their pre-flight checks without verifying that those passengers understood their responsibilities. When she discreetly examined her seatbelt, she found the webbing was frayed near the metal clasp with threads visibly pulling apart. She wondered how many other seatbelts on this aircraft had been inadequately inspected. These weren't just customer service failures, they were serious safety violations that threatened every passenger on board. Each one represented a failure in Atlantic SkyLine's safety management system, a crack in the foundation of their operational integrity. The turbulence eventually subsided, but Dr. Reynolds's concerns only grew. She observed Morgan conducting a cursory cabin check that consisted of little more than a glance down each aisle, without actually verifying that tray tables were up and secured, or that seatbacks were in their upright positions for landing. When an announcement came over the PA system asking if there was a doctor on board for a medical issue in economy, Elena rushed to help, while Morgan continued her magazine crossword puzzle showing no urgency whatsoever. It took 3 calls before Morgan finally put down her pen with an exaggerated sigh and moved to assist. Every incident was another data point, another piece of evidence in what was becoming a damning case against not just individual crew members, but against the entire operational culture of Atlantic SkyLine. Dr. Reynolds's trained eye didn't miss the A320 maintenance checklist that had been signed off but clearly not completed visible from her seat position. She noted how the flight attendants conducted their safety demonstration, rushing through critical oxygen mask instructions in 12 seconds instead of the mandated 45-second minimum. Each violation was meticulously categorized in her mind. FR 121.589 for unsecured galley equipment, FR 121.571 for inadequate safety briefing, FR 121.391 for improper crew coordination during turbulence. The list grew longer with each passing hour. This wasn't about a personal slight anymore. This was about the safety of every passenger on this aircraft and every future Atlantic SkyLine flight. It was about a breakdown in the fundamental covenant between an airline and its passengers, the promise that safety would always come first. As Dr. Reynolds documented each violation, her resolve strengthened. This wasn't just an opportunity for accountability. It was her responsibility as FAA director to ensure that these failures were addressed at their root cause. The flight was only halfway to Los Angeles, and already she had witnessed enough violations to trigger a comprehensive safety review. But she would continue to observe, to document, to build an irrefutable case that would force meaningful change. Because the next time Atlantic SkyLine cut corners, it might not just result in discomfort or inconvenience. It might cost lives. As the flight progressed, Dr. Reynolds expanded her observations beyond the immediate crew interactions to assess the overall cabin environment. The physical conditions of the aircraft told their own story about Atlantic SkyLine's operational priorities. She noticed that several overhead reading lights in the rear section were non-functional. The call button above seat 36C was completely missing, leaving a small hole in the panel. The seat in front of her had a tray table that wouldn't remain level, tilting dangerously whenever anything was placed on it. These issues might seem minor to the average passenger, but to Dr. Reynolds' experienced eye, they were significant indicators. Aircraft interiors underwent regular maintenance checks precisely to identify and repair such issues. The presence of multiple defects suggested that these inspections were being performed inadequately, or that identified problems were being deferred beyond reasonable timeframes. The cabin temperature varied dramatically from zone to zone, uncomfortably warm near her row but cold enough several rows ahead that passengers had requested blankets. This indicated potential issues with the environmental control system, another area that required regular monitoring and maintenance. The lavatory nearest to her row had an out-of-order sign handwritten on a napkin, not an official placard, suggesting it hadn't been properly reported through maintenance channels. When she briefly investigated, she found that the smoke detector had been covered with what appeared to be a plastic bag, a significant fire safety violation that should have been caught during pre-flight checks. Even more concerning was the overhead bin directly across from row 37, which didn't fully close. A flight attendant had simply stuffed a blanket into the gap to keep it from popping open, rather than properly securing it or removing items to allow it to latch correctly. In turbulence or a hard landing, that improperly secured bin could easily spring open, sending heavy items onto passengers' heads. Dr. Reynolds watched the crew dynamics as well. Morgan clearly dominated the cabin crew hierarchy. When Elena attempted to address passenger concerns proactively, Morgan often interrupted or countermanded her instructions. At one point, she overheard Morgan criticizing Elena for wasting time by helping an elderly passenger stow her bag. The toxic leadership created a dysfunctional working environment that directly impacted safety. Elena and another junior attendant exchanged glances whenever Morgan issued contradictory instructions, clearly aware of the problems, but unable to address them without risking their positions. During a brief conversation with her seatmates, Dr. Reynolds learned that this wasn't an isolated experience. The man to her right, a sales representative who flew this route monthly, mentioned that Atlantic SkyLine service had been deteriorating for the past year. "They used to be my preferred airline," he said quietly, making sure Morgan couldn't overhear. "Now I only fly with them when my company books it. Their on-time performance is terrible. They've had 3 emergency landings on this route in 6 months, and the crew always seems stressed and unhappy." The woman to her left, a college student returning home, added that she'd noticed items missing from the safety cards. "I'm studying aviation management," she explained. "I always check these things. Half the information about water evacuations is missing from this card. It's like they photocopied an old version and just stuck it in here." These conversations provided context for Dr. Reynolds' observations, confirming that the problems she was witnessing weren't anomalies, but patterns. This wasn't a bad day or a single difficult crew. This was evidence of pervasive organizational dysfunction. As she continued her assessment, Dr. Reynolds mentally connected these cabin environment issues to the relevant FAA regulations. Each defect, each deferred maintenance item, each improper repair represented a specific compliance failure. Together, they painted a picture of an airline that had normalized corner cutting and workarounds, rather than adhering to required standards. By the time the captain announced they were beginning their initial descent into Los Angeles, Dr. Reynolds had compiled a comprehensive mental inventory of cabin environment issues, each one documented with the precision that had made her such an effective regulator. The evidence was mounting, and with it the certainty that Atlantic SkyLine needed more than just a warning. They needed a complete safety culture overhaul. 3 hours into the flight, as passengers settled into the monotony of transcontinental travel, Dr. Reynolds observed Elena Rodriguez making her way slowly down the aisle. The junior flight attendant moved with purpose, but without Morgan's hovering presence, her demeanor noticeably different, more natural, less defensive. Elena was collecting trash methodically, working her way toward the rear of the aircraft. When she reached row 38, she paused. Her eyes met Dr. Reynolds, and in that brief moment, Elena's professional mask slipped. Her expression was one of sincere apology. "Ma'am," she whispered, leaning in slightly. "Can I get you anything? A bottle of water, perhaps, or a snack from the front?" It was a small gesture, but it was an act of quiet rebellion against the hostile environment Morgan had created. Elena was taking a professional risk, offering premium cabin service to a passenger who had been deliberately relegated to the worst seat on the plane. A bottle of water would be lovely. "Thank you," Dr. Reynolds replied, her voice equally soft. "What is your name, Elena?" she answered, offering a small, nervous smile. "Elena Rodriguez." "Thank you, Elena. I appreciate your professionalism," Dr. Reynolds said, making sure her words carried a specific weight. Elena's eyes widened slightly at the deliberate formality of the response, perhaps sensing that Dr. Reynolds was not an ordinary passenger. She nodded once before continuing her duties, glancing briefly toward the forward galley to ensure Morgan wasn't watching. She returned moments later with a chilled bottle of water, the kind usually reserved for the premium cabins, discreetly placing it on Dr. Reynolds' tray table with a napkin. "I'm sorry about earlier," Elena murmured, arranging the napkin with deliberate care to create a momentary excuse for conversation. It's not how it should be." Dr. Reynolds nodded in understanding. "How long have you been with Atlantic SkyLine?" "Elena?" "6 months," she replied. "This is my first airline position." That explained both her diligence and her hesitancy. Elena was new enough to still remember her training clearly, to still care about doing things properly, but she was also junior enough to be vulnerable to fear challenging Morgan's toxic authority. "You're doing an excellent job under difficult circumstances," Dr. Reynolds said quietly. Elena's expression shifted, surprise followed by something like relief. "Thank you," she whispered. "I should continue my rounds." As Elena moved on, Dr. Reynolds made a mental note of this interaction. It was a critical data point in her assessment. It proved that Atlantic SkyLine's problems weren't necessarily universal. There were good employees like Elena trained properly and committed to service, trapped in a toxic system that punished excellence and rewarded compliance with bad practices. The contrast between Morgan's deliberate hostility and Elena's quiet professionalism was stark. It suggested that Atlantic SkyLine's issues weren't just about inadequate training or insufficient resources. They were about a failure of leadership, about the wrong people setting the tone and establishing dangerous norms. In her years of aviation oversight, Dr. Reynolds had learned that organizational change was most effective when it built upon existing strengths. Elena represented a potential foundation for reform, the kind of employee who could thrive in a healthier environment and help rebuild a safety-focused culture. As she sipped the cool water, Dr. Reynolds reflected on how this simple act of kindness had illuminated something essential about Atlantic SkyLine's situation. The airline wasn't beyond saving. There were elements worth preserving, people worth supporting. Her eventual response wouldn't just be punitive. It would need to identify and elevate employees like Elena while removing the toxic influences that prevented them from maintaining proper standards. This brief interaction had added an important dimension to Dr. Reynolds' developing assessment. It wasn't just about documenting failures anymore. It was about identifying a path forward, a way to transform Atlantic SkyLine's broken culture into one that protected both passengers and conscientious employees. The water bottle wasn't just refreshing, it was revealing. And it would inform the recommendations that would eventually reshape not just this airline, but potentially the industry's approach to service and safety culture. As the flight continued its journey westward, Dr. Reynolds engaged in brief, careful conversations with her fellow passengers. These interactions provided valuable context for her observations, offering insights into how regularly Atlantic SkyLine's problems manifested. The man to her right introduced himself as Michael Dawson, a pharmaceutical sales representative who flew between New York and Los Angeles twice monthly. His frequent traveler status made his perspectives particularly valuable. Atlantic SkyLine used to be top tier, he confided, keeping his voice low. Something changed about a year ago. New management cost-cutting measures. The experienced crew members either left or stopped caring. Maintenance delays have tripled. I've started booking my return flights with other carriers whenever possible. His observations aligned with what Dr. Reynolds had witnessed. Not isolated incidents, but evidence of organizational decline. The young woman by the window, Lucia Martinez, was a UCLA aviation management student who viewed the flight through a professionally curious lens. "I've been taking notes for my cabin operations class," she whispered. "This flight violates at least 6 best practices we just studied last semester." She showed Dr. Reynolds her notebook, where she had discreetly documented issues ranging from improper safety briefings to non-compliant galley stowage. Her observations, while less technical than Dr. Reynolds' own assessment, confirmed that the problems were objectively visible even to a trained student. Halfway through the flight, an off-duty pilot in civilian clothes made his way down the aisle toward the lavatory. He paused briefly beside row 38, his trained eyes scanning Dr. Reynolds with subtle recognition. He'd clearly seen her photograph in industry publications or regulatory communications. Their exchange was brief but significant. "Quite a flight," he murmured, his identification badge partially visible under his jacket. "Captain James Mercer, Atlantic SkyLine." "Indeed," Dr. Reynolds replied neutrally. "Some of us still care about doing things right," he added almost inaudibly before continuing toward the lavatory. This fleeting interaction was particularly telling. It confirmed that Atlantic SkyLine still employed professionals who recognized the deterioration in standards and were concerned about it. It suggested internal tensions between those maintaining proper practices and those allowing standards to slip. During a period of moderate turbulence, Dr. Reynolds overheard a conversation between two flight attendants who didn't realize she was listening. "Just skip the full safety check," Morgan was telling another crew member. "We're already behind schedule and regional ops won't notice. Just mark it as completed." "But the forward lavatory smoke detector is still showing the fault light," the other attendant protested weakly. "It's been like that for 3 flights. Maintenance keeps deferring it. Just sign it off like everyone else does." This exchange documented not just individual negligence but a pattern of deliberate falsification of safety records. A serious violation that could trigger significant penalties. Other passengers shared their experiences as well. A family seated across the aisle mentioned that their outbound flight on Atlantic SkyLine had been forced to return to the gate due to air conditioning failure, yet the same aircraft was immediately redeployed without proper repair. An elderly couple complained that call buttons in their section of a previous Atlantic SkyLine flight had been deliberately disabled because the crew was short-staffed. A businessman in an expensive suit walked past on his way to the lavatory, noticed Dr. Reynolds, and paused. "They did the same thing to my colleague last month," he said quietly. "Bumped her from first to the last row for no reason. She's also black. I don't think that's a coincidence." Each interaction added another dimension to Dr. Reynolds' understanding of Atlantic SkyLine's operational reality. These weren't isolated incidents or subjective impressions. They were consistent experiences across a diverse range of passengers, suggesting deep structural issues within the airline's culture and practices. By creating a composite picture from these interactions, Dr. Reynolds could see beyond her own experience to recognize the scope of the problem. Atlantic SkyLine wasn't just having a bad day or a challenging flight. It was operating with a fundamentally flawed approach to both service and safety, one that had become normalized within the organization but was glaringly obvious to those who experienced it. As the cabin lights dimmed for those who wished to rest, Dr. Reynolds continued her mental documentation, now enriched by these multiple perspectives. The case for intervention was growing stronger with each passenger's story, each overheard conversation, each observed violation. What had begun as a personal slight had revealed itself to be symptomatic of an airline in dangerous organizational decline. And as the FAA director, she had not just the authority, but the responsibility to address it. The gentle bump of the wheels touching the runway at LAX sent a collective sigh of relief through the cabin of Flight AS847. For most passengers, it signaled the end of a long journey. For Dr. Reynolds, it signaled the beginning of her work. The usual frenzy erupted as the seatbelt sign pinged off. The rustle of clothing, the clicking of overhead bins, the low murmur of conversations as people reconnected with the world via their phones. Dr. Reynolds, however, remained perfectly still in her seat. She was an island of tranquility in a sea of frantic motion. She had no desire to join the crush of bodies in the aisle. Her time in seat 38B was not quite over. She would see this experience through to its absolute conclusion. She watched as the passengers from the forward cabins began to file past. Richard Whitman, The smug occupant of her rightful seat 2A shouldered his way down the aisle, grumbling impatiently, never once glancing in her direction. His sense of entitlement was a palpable aura around him. A few moments later, Morgan Taylor appeared. Her face was plastered with a smile so artificial it looked painful. She was performing the final ritual of her job, bidding farewell to the passengers she had spent the last 5 hours neglecting. "Thank you for flying with us today," Morgan recited mechanically as passengers shuffled past. "We hope you enjoyed your flight." As she passed row 38, her eyes met Dr. Reynolds for a fraction of a second. There was no recognition or apology in Morgan's gaze, only a cold, dismissive finality. She saw a problem that had been solved, a nuisance that had been contained. She had no idea she was looking at the architect of her professional demise. Elena appeared next, her farewell to departing passengers noticeably warmer and more genuine. When she reached Dr. Reynolds' row, there was a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes, a silent communication between two professionals who recognized each other's dignity despite the circumstances. Dr. Reynolds waited patiently until the last passenger had shuffled past. She gathered her single leather carry-on, her movements unhurried and deliberate. As she walked up the now empty aisle, she gave the cabin one last look. It wasn't just an airplane anymore. It was evidence. A collection of violations, shortcuts, and neglected responsibilities that would soon be subjected to the full scrutiny of federal oversight. She noted the final safety violations visible during deplaning. The emergency exit row placard was partially obscured by a loose piece of trim. A ceiling panel near the forward galley was improperly secured, revealing wiring that should have been covered. The main cabin door's safety indicator showed signs of tampering, another item that should have been caught during pre-flight inspections. As she stepped off the aircraft, Elena was standing at the door. "Thank you for flying with us," she said with a sincerity absent from Morgan's identical words. Dr. Reynolds paused briefly. "Thank you for your professionalism, Elena." It was noticed and appreciated. A look of surprise crossed the young flight attendant's face, followed by the faintest smile. "Safe travels, ma'am." Dr. Reynolds moved through the bustling terminal, the vibrant chaos of LAX a stark contrast to the sterile hostility of the flight. People were rushing to meet loved ones, their faces bright with smiles and tears of reunion. Business travelers marched purposefully toward ground transportation, already barking into their phones. Instead of heading toward the exit, Dr. Reynolds found what she was looking for: a large panoramic window in a quieter concourse that offered a commanding view of the airfield. Below her, the vast, intricate dance of aviation played out. Baggage carts zipped across the tarmac, fuel trucks serviced massive jets, and planes from a dozen different airlines taxied, took off, and landed. Her eyes found an Atlantic SkyLine 747 being pushed back from its gate, its bold blue and white livery gleaming in the California sunshine. Another aircraft bearing the same colors was in final approach, seconds from touching down. Thousands of passengers trusting their lives to an airline that had just demonstrated a profound disregard for proper procedures and basic safety protocols. This was the right place. She reached into her handbag, her fingers bypassing the familiar sleekness of her personal iPhone. They closed around a heavier, starker device, a government-issued satellite phone encased in hardened black polymer, devoid of any branding or stylish flair. It was a tool, not a toy, a direct encrypted link to the nerve center of American aviation. This was the phone used for incidents, for emergencies, for matters of national importance. In her mind, what she had witnessed on Flight AS847 qualified. She dialed a single memorized number. It was answered before the first ring had even finished. Director's office. "This is Thomas." The regulatory machinery that would transform Atlantic SkyLine Airlines was about to roar to life. Director's office. "This is Thomas." The voice of her chief of staff was, as always, crisp and efficient. "Thomas, it's Gabrielle," she said, her own voice steady and calm. "Are you in a secure location?" The question immediately changed the tenor of the call. "Yes, Director. I'm in your office." he replied, a note of alert attention now in his tone. "Is everything all right? Your flight should have just landed." "The flight has landed, but everything is not all right," Dr. Reynolds stated. "I need you to listen very carefully and execute 2 directives for me immediately." She gazed down at the Atlantic SkyLine aircraft, now taxiing toward the runway, the same plane that had carried her across the country in what amounted to a flying demonstration of regulatory negligence. "First, I want you to get David Lawrence on a secure line. He is the Executive Vice President of Operations for Atlantic SkyLine Airlines. You will use my authority to bypass any gatekeepers. I don't care what he is doing. You will interrupt him. Conference us in. This is a matter of urgent federal concern." There was a brief pause, filled only with the sound of furious typing from Thomas's end. "David Lawrence, Atlantic SkyLine, understood, Director. And the second directive, I am initiating a director-level inquiry into Flight AS847 JFK to LAX today's date. I need you to pull the complete flight and crew manifest immediately. I want the full names, employee IDs, and the unredacted service and disciplinary records for every single crew member associated with that flight. Pay special attention to the senior gate agent at JFK Gate B24, a woman named Allison Peterson, and the lead flight attendant, Morgan Taylor. I want that entire file on my secure tablet within the hour." The sheer gravity and specificity of the request made Thomas pause again. "Director," he asked carefully, "may I ask what prompted this? Was there an incident reported by the flight crew?" Dr. Reynolds gazed down at the Atlantic SkyLine jet now taxiing toward the runway. "No, Thomas," she said, her voice dropping to an icy, chillingly personal register. "The incident was not reported by the crew. It was experienced by me. I was a passenger on that flight." She let the statement hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final, devastating detail. "I was in seat 38B. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Thomas Wilson had served as her chief of staff long enough to understand the implications immediately. Dr. Reynolds never traveled in economy, certainly not in a middle seat in the last row. The fact that she had been placed there could only mean one thing: a deliberate and egregious act of disrespect by the airline staff, who hadn't recognized her. "I understand," Director Thomas replied, his voice now reflecting the severity of the situation. "I'll have David Lawrence on the line within 10 minutes and the personnel files within the hour. Should I alert Enforcement Division?" "Not yet," Dr. Reynolds replied. "This isn't just about punitive action. I witnessed multiple safety violations that suggest organizational failure. I want a comprehensive task force assembled. Safety inspectors, operations specialists, training auditors. I want them at Atlantic SkyLine's JFK and LAX hubs at 0800 tomorrow morning. No advance notice." "Yes, Director. Full task force, no notice, 0800 tomorrow. Anything else?" "Yes. I want you to pull Atlantic SkyLine's safety record for the past 3 years. Incident reports, maintenance logs, crew, complaints, passenger grievances. I want to know if what I experienced today is an anomaly or a pattern." "I suspect it's a pattern," Thomas said quietly. "So do I," Dr. Reynolds agreed. "But we'll follow the evidence." And Thomas, "Yes, Director. When you get David Lawrence on the line, don't tell him why I'm calling. Let him discover that for himself." "Understood, Director." Dr. Reynolds ended the call and tucked the secure phone back into her handbag. She looked out at the sprawling airfield once more, at the dozens of aircraft arriving and departing at the complex choreography of modern aviation that functioned safely only when every participant adhered to established protocols and procedures. What she had witnessed today wasn't just a failure of customer service. It was a breakdown in the fundamental covenant between an airline and its passengers. The promise that safety would always come first, that rules would be followed, that professionals would behave professionally. Atlantic SkyLine had broken that covenant, and now they would face the consequences. She checked her watch. Within 10 minutes, her secure tablet would ping with an incoming call. Within an hour, she would have detailed files on every crew member. By this time tomorrow, Atlantic SkyLine's operations would be under the microscope of the most thorough federal inspection they had ever experienced, all because they had made the catastrophic error of demoting the wrong passenger to seat 38B. David Lawrence, Executive Vice President of Operations for Atlantic SkyLine Airlines, was in his element. He stood at the head of a gleaming mahogany table in the 40th floor boardroom, a space designed to project power and invincibility. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the sprawling metropolis of Los Angeles lay before him, a concrete kingdom he helped to conquer one flight path at a time. He was mid-presentation, masterfully guiding the executive committee through a series of slides that painted a rosy picture of rising profits and operational efficiencies. The numbers were good, his delivery was flawless, and CEO Victoria Blackwell was nodding in approval. David was confident, charismatic, and completely in control of his universe. It was in this moment of corporate triumph that his assistant, a young, perpetually nervous man named Alex, slipped into the room. He moved with the silent, apologetic gait of someone delivering bad news, placing a dedicated conference phone on the table beside David. A bright yellow sticky note was affixed to its receiver. In Alex's frantic scrawl, 5 words were written: urgent, FAA Director's Office, mandatory. David felt a surge of irritation. A mandatory call was an intrusion, a crack in the perfect facade of his presentation. The FAA. It was likely a tedious new directive or a query about a minor runway incident. He shot Alex a withering glare for the interruption before offering the board a practiced, reassuring smile. "Gentlemen, ladies, if you'll excuse me for a moment. It seems Washington calls. I'm sure it won't take but a minute." He strode into his adjoining private office, the plush carpet swallowing the sound of his expensive Italian shoes. He closed the heavy glass door, shutting out the boardroom, but not his annoyance. He sank into his high-back leather chair, the skyline of his kingdom behind him, and picked up the receiver. "This is David Lawrence," he announced, his voice smooth and imbued with the easy authority of a man who rarely had to ask for anything twice. "Mr. Lawrence, please hold for Director Reynolds," a dispassionate male voice instructed. David's posture straightened slightly. The director, Gabrielle Reynolds. He knew the name, of course. She was a formidable figure, a woman spoken of in aviation circles with a mixture of respect and fear. He had never spoken with her directly. He cleared his throat, his annoyance quickly morphing into a cautious curiosity. A moment later, a woman's voice came on the line. It was calm, measured, and carried an intrinsic weight that made David feel as if he were suddenly the junior executive in the room. "Mr. Lawrence, this is Dr. Gabrielle Reynolds. Thank you for taking my call." "Director Reynolds, the honor is all mine," David said, his corporate charm automatically engaging. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I hope there isn't a problem." "There is a problem, Mr. Lawrence. A significant one." Her tone was utterly devoid of pleasantries. It was the voice of a regulator, not a colleague. "I'm calling you about Flight AS847 from JFK to LAX, which landed a short while ago." David's mind instantly began shuffling through data. He swiveled in his chair to face his desktop computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He brought up the flight's operational log. AS847. "Yes, I see it here. Landed on time. No pilot-logged incidents, no maintenance flags. Was there a security issue I haven't been briefed on?" "You could call it an incident," Dr. Reynolds replied, her voice as cool and sterile as an operating theater. "I want you to listen very carefully. I'm going to recount the events of my day, and you are not to interrupt me." The command was so absolute that David felt an involuntary prickle of unease. He leaned forward, listening intently as this powerful woman on the other end of the line began to speak. She started at the check-in podium at JFK, and with a terrifying forensic level of detail, painted a picture of gross incompetence and prejudice. She named the gate agent, Allison Peterson. She quoted Allison's exact words. "Equipment change. Your seat is unavailable." She described her calm, reasonable inquiries being met with dismissal and contempt. David scribbled furiously on a legal pad. "Passenger complaint, first class, JFK, Allison Peterson." His mind was already in damage control mode. A high-profile passenger clearly well connected to have the director's ear had been mistreated. It was bad but manageable. He would fire the gate agent, issue a profound apology, and offer a mountain of frequent flyer miles. He would smooth this over. Then Dr. Reynolds' narrative moved on to the aircraft itself. "I was issued a new boarding pass, Mr. Lawrence, for seat 38B. David's pen stopped moving. 38B. The last row a middle seat. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This was worse than he thought. This wasn't just a mishandled upgrade. This was a calculated act of humiliation. "On board your aircraft," Dr. Reynolds continued, her voice an icy monotone. "My attempts to resolve the issue with your lead flight attendant, Ms. Morgan Taylor, were not only rebuffed, but met with open hostility. I was threatened with having the captain removed from the cockpit to deal with me. I was told, and I quote, 'You have a seat and you should be happy with it.'" The knot in David's stomach became a cold, heavy stone. He could practically hear the multi-million-dollar lawsuit being filed. This was a public relations disaster of the highest order. He waited for her to finish, his mind racing through response strategies. When she finally paused, he jumped in, his voice oozing practiced sincerity. "Director Reynolds, I am at a loss for words. On behalf of every single employee at Atlantic SkyLine Airlines, I am utterly appalled and deeply sorry. This is not our standard. It is a disgusting aberration. I assure you the employees involved will face the most severe disciplinary action. If you'll allow me, I will have my team arrange a full refund, of course, and a first-class travel voucher for you and your family to anywhere we fly for the next year. We will do whatever it takes to make this right. Stop talking, Mr. Lawrence." Dr. Reynolds's command cut through his corporate platitudes and silenced him instantly. "You are still operating under the mistaken assumption that my primary concern is my personal comfort or financial compensation." The line went silent for a long, agonizing moment. David held his breath, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. What could be worse than this? "My concern, Mr. Lawrence," she resumed, "is the litany of Federal Aviation Regulation violations I personally witnessed after your staff relegated me to the back of your aircraft." David's blood ran cold. "My concern is the unsecured service cart that came loose from its galley latch during a period of moderate turbulence, a direct and dangerous violation of Regulation 121.5577. My concern is the structural failure of your cabin crew to respond to passenger call lights, a dereliction of their primary duty of care, which could have fatal consequences in a medical emergency. My concern is the toxic, insubordinate culture demonstrated by your senior crew, which creates an environment where safety protocols are viewed as optional. My comfort is utterly irrelevant. Your airline's flagrant non-compliance with the federal laws that keep passengers alive is not." Every word struck David with the force of a physical blow. He felt the room tilt. Unsecured cart. Regulation violations. And then the final horrifying realization crashed down upon him like a tidal wave of ice and dread. She hadn't been calling on behalf of a wronged passenger. She was the wronged passenger. The woman who was threatened by a flight attendant, the woman who was demoted and humiliated, the woman who was sitting in the worst seat on the plane was the director of the Federal Aviation Administration. You were the passenger in 38B. He stammered, his voice a choked, unrecognizable whisper. The panoramic view from his window suddenly seemed mocking a vista of a kingdom he was about to lose. "I was," Dr. Reynolds confirmed, her voice, now devoid of any emotion at all. It was the voice of judgment. And from my vantage point in 38B, I had a very clear and unobstructed view of the operational deficiencies and cultural rot within Atlantic SkyLine Airlines. David felt a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. His career, his reputation, possibly the entire airline's future, now hung by the thinnest of threads. So this is what is going to happen. Dr. Reynolds continued, her voice calm but implacable. By 9:00 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow, I expect a full, unredacted report on this incident on my desk. It will include the complete service and disciplinary histories of Ms. Peterson and Ms. Taylor, and a sworn affidavit explaining why my confirmed seat was given away. Secondly, at 8:00 a.m. local time tomorrow, a top-tier FAA Safety and Compliance Task Force will be arriving at your JFK and LAX hubs. They will not be making an appointment. They will have full and unrestricted access to all personnel, all aircraft, and all records. I suggest you call your station managers and instruct them that anything less than absolute and immediate cooperation will be considered obstruction of a federal investigation. Am I making myself clear, Mr. Lawrence? David couldn't speak. He could only make a faint gurgling sound. His career was flashing before his eyes. His meticulously built world was shattering. Am I clear? Dr. Reynolds repeated the question, sharp as a shard of glass. Yes, Director. He finally managed to rasp out sweat beading on his forehead and dripping down his temple. Crystal clear. You will have our full cooperation. I am so sorry. Do not be sorry, Mr. Lawrence, Dr. Reynolds said, her voice chillingly final. Your apology is irrelevant. What matters is whether 200 passengers will land safely tomorrow because of what we do today. The line went dead. David Lawrence sat frozen in his chair, the phone still clutched in his trembling hand. The silence in his office was absolute. He stared blankly at his computer screen at the clean, orderly flight log for AS847. It was a lie. Everything was a lie. He had just been on the phone with a passenger his company had deemed worthless, who had turned out to be the one person who could bring his entire empire to its knees. He slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle, took a deep, shuddering breath, and screamed for his assistant. The panic was no longer a rising tide. It was a tsunami, and it was about to obliterate everything in its path. The silence that followed the dead phone line in David Lawrence's office was the calm at the heart of a hurricane. For a full 10 seconds he was paralyzed, a statue of pure terror. Then the adrenaline hit him like a lightning strike. He didn't just call his assistant. He burst from his office, his face ashen, his eyes wide with a primal fear that sent a wave of panic through the entire executive floor. Get me CEO Blackwell on a secure line. Now, he bellowed, his voice cracking. Get legal, get HR, get in-flight services conference call, emergency priority 1, move. The ensuing conference call was not a discussion. It was an exercise in corporate terror, as David recounted his conversation with Director Reynolds. A chilling silence fell over the airline's most powerful executives. Victoria Blackwell, a woman known for her unflappable demeanor, was reduced to hoarse whispers. The legal team was apoplectic, already calculating the astronomical liability. Let me be absolutely clear, David said, his voice strained. Director Reynolds wasn't calling on behalf of someone. She was the passenger in 38B. She was personally humiliated by our staff, personally threatened by our flight attendant, and personally witnessed multiple safety violations. The revelation landed like a bomb. In the aviation industry, there was perhaps no single person with more power to damage an airline than the FAA director, and they had managed to antagonize her in the most personal way possible. What exactly did she witness? Asked Martin Cooper, Atlantic SkyLine's chief safety officer, his voice tight with dread. David read from his hastily scribbled notes, each item more damning than the last unsecured service cart during turbulence. Regulation 121.577 violation, failure to respond to call buttons, multiple incidents, incorrect safety briefing cards throughout the cabin, frayed seatbelts not identified in pre-flight checks, smoke detector in lavatory covered with plastic, major fire safety violation, overhead bin improperly secured with a blanket stuffed in the gap, and perhaps most damning, she overheard Morgan Taylor explicitly instructing another flight attendant to falsify a safety check record. With each item, the temperature in the virtual room seemed to drop further. These weren't minor infractions. They were serious safety violations that, taken together, painted a picture of an airline with dangerously lax standards and a broken safety culture. "How bad is this going to be?" Victoria Blackwell asked, her usual commanding tone replaced by something close to resignation. Martin Cooper cleared his throat. "Madam CEO, I've been in aviation safety for 30 years. If even half of these allegations are substantiated, and given that the FAA director personally witnessed them, we have to assume they all are, we're looking at the most severe regulatory response I've ever seen. Multi-million-dollar fines at minimum, possible grounding of aircraft, mandatory retraining of all crew, and that's assuming they don't find similar violations when they inspect tomorrow." "Can we contain this?" Blackwell asked. "Contain it." Cooper's laugh was hollow. "Director Reynolds has already initiated a director-level inquiry. That's the highest possible response short of an emergency grounding order. There's no containing this. Our only option is full, immediate cooperation and a demonstrable commitment to addressing every issue she identified." The legal team began outlining potential financial impacts. Fines that could reach into the tens of millions, potential class action lawsuits from passengers who had experienced similar treatment, stock price implications when the news inevitably broke. "What about Peterson and Taylor?" David asked. The gate agent and flight attendant, immediate termination, said Heather Morris from HR without hesitation. "We need to demonstrate decisive action. Their conduct was indefensible, even if the passenger had been anyone else. The fact that it was the FAA director means we need to make it unambiguously clear that they don't represent our values." "What about Whitman?" asked Victoria. "The passenger who took her seat," David grimaced. "According to Director Reynolds, he appears to have had some arrangement with Peterson. We'll need to investigate that immediately. If there was any kind of bribery or fraud involved." "This gets worse by the minute," Victoria said, her voice hollow. "David, I want you on a plane to Washington tonight. You will personally deliver that report to Director Reynolds' office at 9 a.m. tomorrow. You will express our deepest apologies. You will outline the immediate steps we're taking." "Yes, ma'am," David responded, though the thought of facing the FAA director after today's catastrophe made his stomach churn. Martin Victoria continued addressing the safety officer. "I want you to personally meet the FAA task force when they arrive. Give them unrestricted access to everything. No obstruction, no delays, no excuses." "Understood," Martin replied grimly. "But I have to warn you, they're going to find more issues, if what happened today is indicative of our general operations." He didn't need to finish the thought. Everyone on the call knew the implications. If these violations were widespread rather than isolated, Atlantic SkyLine wasn't just facing fines and bad publicity. They were facing an existential threat to their very ability to operate. "One more thing," Victoria said, her CEO voice reasserting itself. "No one, and I mean no one, speaks to the press about this. Not a word. If this leaks, we'll have a PR nightmare on top of everything else." But even as she issued the command, all of them knew it was probably too late. In the age of smartphones and social media, the odds that no one had witnessed or recorded Dr. Reynolds' humiliation were vanishingly small. It was only a matter of time before the passenger in 38B became a headline, a hashtag, a symbol of everything wrong with how airlines treated their passengers. The call ended with a flurry of action items and a heavy pall of dread. As executives rushed to implement damage control measures, David Lawrence sat alone in his office, staring at the phone that had delivered the most devastating news of his career. He thought about Allison Peterson and Morgan Taylor, their careers now in ruins, because they had made the catastrophic error of mistreating the one passenger they should have treated with reverence. He thought about Richard Whitman, whose cheap upgrade scheme was about to cost him far more than the price of a first-class ticket. Most of all, he thought about Dr. Gabrielle Reynolds, sitting quietly in seat 38B for 5 hours, observing, documenting, building the case that might bring Atlantic SkyLine to its knees. The woman they had tried to make invisible had seen everything. And now, everyone would see her power. While corporate panic engulfed Atlantic SkyLine's executive offices, Dr. Gabrielle Reynolds was calmly conducting a video call with her chief of staff from her hotel suite in Los Angeles. Thomas Wilson had worked for her for 7 years, following her from the NTSB to the FAA. He understood not just the letter of aviation regulations, but their spirit, the fundamental commitment to safety and integrity that underpinned the entire industry. "I've assembled the task force," Director Thomas reported. 20 of our best inspectors will hit JFK and LAX simultaneously at 0800 tomorrow. I've also pulled the data you requested. He gestured to a formidable stack of documents visible on his desk. Atlantic SkyLine's safety record for the past 3 years doesn't look good. Dr. Reynolds nodded, unsurprised. What are we seeing? A clear pattern of deterioration. 3 years ago, their compliance ratings were industry standard. 2 years ago, they began slipping. Last year, they fell into the bottom quartile. And the first 2 quarters of this year show continued decline. Passenger complaints, Dr. Reynolds asked. Up 72% year over year. Most concerning complaints specifically mentioning safety issues have tripled. And employee reports. Thomas grimaced. That's perhaps the most troubling indicator. Voluntary safety reporting by employees has dropped by 60%. Either their staff has stopped noticing problems, or they've stopped reporting them because nothing gets fixed. Dr. Reynolds finished his thought. Classic signs of a deteriorating safety culture. Exactly. Thomas agreed. And we've identified multiple instances where similar violations to what you witnessed were reported but resulted in no corrective action. Dr. Reynolds absorbed this information with the calm deliberation that had become her trademark. This wasn't just about one flight or one instance of discriminatory treatment. This was about an airline consistently abandoning its commitment to safety and proper operations. "Has David Lawrence booked his flight to Washington?" she asked. Thomas nodded. "Confirmed on the 11 p.m. from LAX. He'll be in your office at 9 a.m. sharp." "Good. And the consent order legal is finalizing it now. It's the most comprehensive I've ever seen." Dr. Reynolds nodded, satisfied with the preparations. The consent order would be the formal mechanism through which the FAA would mandate specific changes at Atlantic SkyLine. It wasn't just a punitive document. It was a roadmap for reform, a detailed prescription for fixing what had clearly become a dangerously broken airline. "I want to make something very clear, Thomas," Dr. Reynolds said, her voice measured but firm. "This isn't about retribution for how I was treated. That incident simply opened the door to discovering much more serious issues. Our response must be proportional to the actual safety violations, not to my personal experience." "Understood, Director. But the personal discrimination you experienced is relevant insofar as it reflects the airline's overall culture and adherence to regulations." "Exactly. It's a symptom, not the disease. And our treatment must address the underlying condition, not just the visible signs, Doctor." Reynolds turned her attention to the specifics of the consent order, reviewing each element with meticulous care. A comprehensive audit of all Atlantic SkyLine aircraft with mandatory grounding of any showing similar maintenance deficiencies to what I observed. Complete retraining of all flight crews with emphasis on safety protocols and proper passenger treatment. Implementation of an anonymous reporting system for safety concerns with direct oversight from an FAA-appointed monitor. financial penalties structured not just as punishment, but to fund specific improvements in training and safety systems. A top-to-bottom review of the airline's organizational culture with particular attention to how management responds to reported issues. And most importantly, she added the installation of an independent safety oversight committee with real authority to implement changes. Thomas nodded approvingly. "It's thorough. They won't like it." "They don't have to like it, Doctor," Reynolds replied. "They have to comply with it. This isn't a negotiation." As they continued to refine the specifics of the FAA's response, Dr. Reynolds received a notification that David Lawrence had sent an email requesting a private conversation before their official meeting tomorrow. He wants to work something out before the formal proceedings begin, Thomas said, reading the message with undisguised disdain. Dr. Reynolds' expression remained impassive. Reply with the following: "Mr. Lawrence, there will be no private conversation. There will be no negotiated settlement. There will be a full accounting of Atlantic SkyLine's safety violations, followed by a comprehensive remediation plan which your airline will implement in its entirety. The terms are not subject to discussion. I will see you at 9 a.m. Thomas couldn't suppress a slight smile as he typed the response. "That's clear enough. This isn't personal," Dr. Reynolds reminded him, "but it is deadly serious. What I witnessed today wasn't just discourtesy or poor service. It was a series of violations that put lives at risk. And I have every reason to believe it represents a pattern, not an isolated incident. The preliminary reports from employees who've come forward since we announced the investigation seem to confirm that Thomas noted. We've already received 17 confidential communications from current and former Atlantic SkyLine staff describing similar or worse violations." Dr. Reynolds nodded gravely. "Then we proceed exactly as planned. Full inspection, maximum penalties, comprehensive oversight, and a clear message to the entire industry that this kind of operational negligence will not be tolerated." As she concluded the call with Thomas, Dr. Reynolds turned her attention to the dinner she had promised her niece. Tonight she would be Aunt Gabby again, celebrating Zoe's achievement and sharing a meal at their favorite restaurant. Tomorrow she would return to being Director Reynolds, the unyielding guardian of aviation safety. But even as she prepared to set work aside for the evening, she knew that what had begun with a seat reassignment would end with the transformation of an entire airline. And perhaps in the process send a message to the entire industry about the unbreakable connection between how they treated their passengers and how they approached their sacred responsibility for safety. The Atlantic SkyLine Crisis Management Team assembled in the executive conference room at their Los Angeles headquarters at 8 p.m., just 3 hours after Dr. Reynolds' fateful call. The atmosphere was tense, with the weight of impending disaster pressing down on everyone present. CEO Victoria Blackwell sat at the head of the table, her usual commanding presence diminished by the gravity of the situation. Around her sat the airline's most senior leaders, the people who would determine whether Atlantic SkyLine survived the coming storm. "Let's start with the immediate actions already taken," she said, her voice tight with controlled stress. "Heather, update on Peterson and Taylor?" Heather Morris, the HR director, nodded crisply. "Both have been terminated effective immediately. Peterson was still at JFK when we reached her. She became combative when informed of the reason. Taylor was at LAX. She initially denied any wrongdoing, then became defensive when told who the passenger had been. Their reactions tell us everything we need to know about the culture problem we're facing," Victoria observed grimly. Any pushback, legally, Peterson mentioned potential wrongful termination, but given the circumstances, our position is exceptionally strong. I've already had their security access revoked and exit interviews scheduled. Full documentation of the terminations has been prepared for the FAA report. Victoria turned to their general counsel, Jeffrey Williams. "Legal assessment." The attorney's expression was grave. "I won't sugarcoat this. We're facing potentially the largest fine in FAA history. Based on the violations Director Reynolds personally witnessed, plus whatever the task force discovers tomorrow, we could be looking at $25–30 million, possibly higher. A palpable wave of shock rippled through the room. The consent order will likely include operational restrictions as well. Jeffrey continued, mandatory grounding of aircraft for inspection, crew retraining requirements, installation of federal monitors. The financial impact goes well beyond the fines themselves. What about the Whitman angle? Victoria asked. We've confirmed through preliminary investigation that Richard Whitman, a VP at Atlas Financial, appears to have had an ongoing arrangement with Peterson. Jeffrey replied. We found evidence of at least 7 previous incidents where she bumped confirmed first-class passengers to accommodate him or his colleagues, apparently in exchange for financial consideration. We've already referred the matter to law enforcement and banned Whitman from the airline. Victoria shook her head in disgust. So not only did we discriminate against the FAA director, but we did it as part of a pattern of corrupt practices. This gets worse by the minute. She turned to Martin Cooper, the safety officer, whose ashen face reflected the professional horror he was experiencing. Martin, what are we facing from a safety standpoint? It's catastrophic, he admitted. I've spent the last 2 hours reviewing our internal safety reports from the past year. The violations Dr. Reynolds observed are not anomalies. They're symptoms of widespread deterioration in our safety culture. He pushed a tablet toward Victoria, displaying a dashboard of safety metrics. All were trending in the wrong direction. The unsecured cart, the smoke detector, tampering the improper emergency equipment. These aren't isolated incidents. They're happening across our fleet. And what's worse, they're being reported by conscientious employees. But those reports are being buried or ignored at the middle management level. How did we miss this? Victoria demanded, her voice rising with anger and disbelief. Because we've been looking at the wrong metrics, Martin admitted. We've been focusing on-time performance, fuel efficiency, labor costs, all the financial indicators. Meanwhile, our safety management system has been dying from neglect. The room fell silent as the full implications sank in. This wasn't just a PR disaster or a regulatory challenge. It was an existential crisis that struck at the very heart of what an airline was supposed to be. The FAA task force is going to find all of this tomorrow, aren't they? Victoria finally asked, though she already knew the answer. Martin nodded grimly. And more. We can't hide it, and we shouldn't try. Our only path forward is complete transparency and a genuine commitment to fixing the problems at their root. Victoria turned to their communications director, Samantha Reed. What's our external posture? Total media lockdown for now, Samantha replied. But we need to prepare for when this breaks, which could be any moment. I'm drafting statements acknowledging the issues, accepting responsibility, and outlining our commitment to addressing them. No deflection, no excuses. And our shareholders. Victoria asked, turning to their CFO. They need to be prepared for significant impact, the financial officer replied grimly. Between the fines, the operational disruptions from the consent order, and the inevitable hit to bookings when this becomes public, we're looking at a potential stock price decline of 30 to 40% in the short term. The weight of that prediction settled heavily over the room. For some airlines, such a financial blow would be fatal. What about the employees on that flight who did the right thing? Victoria asked. The junior flight attendant, Dr. Reynolds mentioned. Elena Rodriguez Heather consulted her tablet. She's been with us 6 months. Exemplary training record. No previous issues. Based on Dr. Reynolds' account, she appears to have been the only crew member who maintained proper standards despite pressure from Taylor. I want her protected, Victoria said firmly. No retaliation. In fact, I want to meet with her personally. People like her are going to be critical to rebuilding our safety culture. The meeting continued late into the night with detailed action plans developed for every aspect of the crisis. As executives finally began to disperse, Victoria asked her safety officer to remain behind. When they were alone, she fixed him with a direct gaze. "Martin, I need your honest assessment. Can we recover from this?" The safety expert was silent for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. "Operationally, yes. Financially, possibly, though it will be painful. But the real question is about our culture, and that's harder to answer. We didn't get here overnight. This is the result of years of prioritizing metrics over safety, of allowing the wrong behaviors to be rewarded while the right ones were ignored or punished." He met her gaze directly. "The real test isn't whether we can satisfy the FAA's consent order. It's whether we can fundamentally transform who we are as an organization. And that starts at the top." The implicit challenge in his words hung in the air between them. Victoria nodded slowly, absorbing the hard truth of his assessment. "Then that's exactly what we'll do," she said with a resolve that suggested she understood the magnitude of the task ahead. "Starting tonight." As the last executives filtered out of the conference room, the reality settled in that Atlantic SkyLine would never be the same again. Whether that meant renewal or ruin would depend on how thoroughly they embraced the painful lessons of Seat 38B. Allison Peterson was still processing the shock of her termination when she was escorted to a private office at JFK for her exit interview. The room was sterile and unwelcoming, with a security officer stationed discreetly by the door. Standard procedure for high-risk terminations, though Allison didn't know that. She sat rigidly in her chair, arms crossed defensively across her chest, her face a mask of indignation. Across from her sat Rachel Donovan from HR, accompanied by station manager Paul Garcia, both wearing expressions of grave seriousness. "This is completely unfair," Allison said before either of them could speak. "I was following procedure for equipment changes. If some entitled passenger complained because she didn't get her way—" "Ms. Peterson?" Rachel interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "Before you continue, I need to show you something." She slid a glossy official photograph across the table. Allison glanced down, then froze. The photograph showed a distinguished black woman in professional attire with a nameplate clearly visible. Dr. Gabrielle Reynolds, Director, Federal Aviation Administration. "Do you recognize this person?" Rachel asked quietly. Allison's face drained of color as realization dawned. Her mind raced back to the interaction at Gate B-24, replaying the calm demeanor of the passenger she had deliberately humiliated, the measured way she had spoken the final ominous words, "Allison Peterson." Today at 2:17 p.m. Gate B-24. This moment will be remembered. That was her. Allison's voice had dropped to a whisper. That was Director Reynolds. Yes, Paul confirmed. The head of the Federal Aviation Administration. The person with direct regulatory authority over every aspect of our operations. Allison's defensive posture crumbled. "I didn't know. How could I have known?" "That's precisely the point, Ms. Peterson," Rachel said. "You shouldn't have treated any passenger the way you treated her. The fact that she happens to be the FAA director only made the consequences more immediate and severe." Paul leaned forward. "Our investigation has already uncovered your arrangement with Richard Whitman. We know this wasn't an equipment change. We know you deliberately bumped Director Reynolds to give her seat to Whitman, apparently in exchange for some form of compensation." Allison's eyes widened in panic. "That's not... I didn't..." "We have the evidence," Allison Paul said, his voice hardening. "Multiple instances. Multiple passengers. And now the worst possible passenger you could have chosen for your scheme." "It wasn't like that," Allison protested weakly. "Richard is a good customer. He flies with us all the time. He just needed a little help occasionally." "What you're describing is fraud," Rachel said bluntly. Defrauding passengers of the seats they paid for, defrauding the airline of premium cabin revenue, potentially accepting bribes. We've already referred the matter to law enforcement. Allison's face crumpled as the full impact of her actions began to register. What's going to happen now? To the airline, a full FAA investigation that will likely result in the largest fine in our history. Operational restrictions and damage to our reputation that could take years to repair, Paul said gravely. To you, that depends on the outcome of the law enforcement investigation, Rachel added. But your employment with Atlantic SkyLine is terminated effective immediately. You'll surrender your credentials today and leave company property. You'll receive no severance or references. As the reality of her situation settled in, Allison's defiance gave way to desperation. It wasn't just me, she said quickly. Everyone does this. It's how things work. If passengers don't look the part, we bump them all the time. It's unofficial policy. Paul and Rachel exchanged troubled glances. This was exactly the kind of cultural problem they feared ran deep in the organization. Who told you this was acceptable? Paul asked carefully. No one had to tell me, Allison replied, a note of confusion in her voice. It's just how things are done. Use your judgment. Take care of the high-value customers. Manage the cabin demographics. The implications were chilling. No written policy endorsed this behavior, yet somehow it had become normalized within the organization. An unspoken rule that discriminatory practices were not only tolerated but expected. Is there anything else you want to tell us about these practices? Rachel asked. Full disclosure now could be helpful to you later. Allison hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Check the group chat. The gate agents at JFK have a private message group. You'll see it's not just me. It's how we were trained informally. Across the country at LAX, a similar scene was unfolding with Morgan Taylor. The senior flight attendant sat stiffly in a conference room, her expression alternating between defiance and disbelief as she was shown the same photograph of Director Reynolds. This is absurd, she declared, though her voice lacked conviction. I was maintaining order in the cabin. If she was so important, why didn't she just say so? That's not how this works, Ms. Taylor said, the in-flight services manager conducting her exit interview. You threatened a passenger for calmly asking about her seat assignment. You deliberately neglected safety procedures. You instructed another crew member to falsify safety checks. None of that would be acceptable regardless of who the passenger was. I've been with this airline for 15 years, Morgan countered, her voice rising. I've never had a complaint filed against me. The manager consulted his tablet. Actually, you've had 27 complaints in the past 3 years alone. They were all handled by your direct supervisor, James Renner. Morgan's expression flickered. Well, James understands the pressures we face. He knows when passengers are just being difficult. And what about the safety violations Director Reynolds observed? The unsecured cart during turbulence, the covered smoke detector in the lavatory. Were those because of difficult passengers too? Morgan shifted uncomfortably. Those are minor issues. Everyone takes shortcuts sometimes. We have to keep the flight on schedule. The manager's expression hardened. Those minor issues and shortcuts could cost lives, Ms. Taylor. They're explicit violations of federal safety regulations, and they appear to reflect a pattern of behavior that you've normalized within your crew. As with Allison Peterson across the country, Morgan's termination interview revealed something far more troubling than individual misconduct. It exposed a culture where safety was secondary to convenience, where discrimination was an unwritten policy, and where employees believed they were simply following the unstated expectations of the organization. By the time both exit interviews concluded, Atlantic SkyLine had gained crucial insights into the depth of their cultural problems, insights that would prove valuable in the difficult months of reformation ahead. But they had also confirmed their worst fears. What Dr. Reynolds had experienced wasn't an anomaly. It was the predictable outcome of a system that had lost its way. And tomorrow, when the FAA task force arrived, they would see it all. At precisely 8:00 a.m. Eastern Time, a team of 10 FAA inspectors entered Atlantic SkyLine's operational headquarters at JFK International Airport. Their arrival was announced only by the flash of federal credentials and the purposeful stride of people on a mission of utmost importance. Simultaneously, a matching team walked through the doors of the airline's LAX facilities on the opposite coast. The coordinated operation had been meticulously planned overnight, designed to capture an authentic snapshot of Atlantic SkyLine's operations before any evidence could be sanitized or procedures hastily corrected. The JFK team was led by Senior Inspector Malcolm Jenkins, a 25-year veteran of aviation oversight with a reputation for thoroughness and fairness. He presented his credentials to the startled receptionist with a professional but firm demeanor. Federal Aviation Administration. We're here to conduct a director-level safety investigation of Atlantic SkyLine operations. Please notify your station manager immediately. Within minutes, they were met by Paul Garcia, who had been waiting anxiously since dawn, knowing this moment was coming, but still unprepared for the reality of seeing 10 federal inspectors in his lobby. Mr. Garcia, we require immediate access to your operational areas, maintenance records, crew documentation, and training materials, Malcolm stated without preamble. We also have a list of personnel we need to interview. We expect full cooperation and unrestricted access. Of course, Inspector Jenkins. Paul replied, his voice steady despite his anxiety. We've been instructed to provide whatever assistance you require. I've prepared a conference room as your command center and all department heads are on standby. Malcolm nodded, appreciating the cooperative approach but maintaining his professional distance. Thank you. Please understand that this investigation will be comprehensive and may be disruptive to your normal operations. However, the more transparent and forthcoming you are, the more efficiently we can proceed. The team dispersed according to their predetermined assignments. Maintenance inspectors headed for the hangars. Operations specialists began reviewing flight logs and dispatch records. Training auditors requested access to crew certification files and simulator records. The inspection was not hostile, but it was relentless in its thoroughness. No corner was too small to examine, no procedure too routine to verify, no record too mundane to review. In Los Angeles, a parallel process was unfolding with similar precision. The FAA team there, led by Senior Inspector Diana Ramirez, had already identified critical discrepancies within the first hour. These maintenance sign-offs don't match the actual work performed, Diana noted, showing a record to Martin Cooper, who had met the team as promised. The log shows a full safety check of cabin emergency equipment on Flight 331 yesterday, but the timestamp indicates the inspection lasted only 7 minutes. That's physically impossible for an A320. Martin nodded grimly. We're seeing exactly the same patterns you are, Inspector. That's why we've already begun our own internal audit. A good start, Diana acknowledged, but our findings will determine the scope of the consent order. I suggest you prepare your leadership for significant mandated changes. As the morning progressed, the investigation expanded from documents to people. Crews reporting for duty were interviewed about safety practices. Gate agents were observed handling passenger interactions. Maintenance technicians were questioned about pressure to expedite aircraft turnarounds. The pattern that emerged was troubling but consistent. Atlantic SkyLine had developed an operational culture that prioritized metrics over safety efficiency, over compliance, and financial performance over regulatory adherence. It wasn't a matter of a few bad employees. It was a structural problem that permeated the organization. By midday, the inspection teams had compiled enough evidence to justify the most severe regulatory response in recent FAA history. They had documented systematic falsification of maintenance records, routine bypassing of required safety checks, pressure on crews to minimize delay reports even when safety issues arose. inadequate training on updated emergency procedures, discrimination in passenger treatment, based on appearance and perceived status. Retaliation against employees who raised safety concerns. Each violation was meticulously documented, photographed, and corroborated by multiple sources. Together, they painted a picture of an airline that had lost sight of its fundamental responsibility to passenger safety. As Inspector Jenkins prepared his preliminary report for transmission to Washington, he reflected on the gravity of what they had found. This wasn't just about regulatory compliance. It was about the lives entrusted to Atlantic SkyLine every day, lives that had been placed at unnecessary risk by a culture that had substituted shortcuts for standards. The evidence was damning, but it was also an opportunity. The consent order that would follow wouldn't just punish Atlantic SkyLine, it would provide a framework for rebuilding it into the airline it was supposed to be. That transformation would be painful and expensive. But as Malcolm typed his conclusions into the secure terminal, he knew it was also necessary. Not just for Atlantic SkyLine, but for the integrity of the entire aviation system. Sometimes the best thing that could happen to an organization was being forced to confront its failures before they led to tragedy. And in that sense, the passenger in seat 38B may have done Atlantic SkyLine the greatest favor possible by exposing its flaws before they resulted in something far worse than embarrassment and fines. The question now was whether the airline's leadership would embrace that painful gift or resist the hard work of genuine reform. At 2:15 p.m., Elena Rodriguez entered Conference Room C at LAX, where two FAA inspectors waited to interview her. She had been on duty since 5 a.m. and had just completed a challenging flight, but fatigue was secondary to the nervous anticipation she felt about this meeting. Word had spread quickly throughout the crew base about the investigation and its connection to Flight AS847 from the previous day. Elena knew she had been specifically requested for this interview, though she didn't yet understand why. "Miss Rodriguez." "Thank you for joining us," said Inspector Diana Ramirez, gesturing to an empty chair. "This is Inspector Carlos Vega. We'd like to ask you some questions about your experiences as a flight attendant with Atlantic SkyLine, particularly regarding Flight AS847 yesterday." Elena sat down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Of course. I want to help however I can. We understand you've only been with the airline for 6 months," Diana began. "What was your training like?" Elena considered the question carefully. The formal training was excellent. The safety protocols, emergency procedures, service standards, everything was comprehensive and professional. But she hesitated, uncertain about how candid to be. "Ms. Rodriguez?" "This is a protected interview," Carlos assured her. "There can be no retaliation against you for honest testimony. We need to understand the reality of operations, not just the official policies." Elena nodded, gathering her courage. "The formal training was excellent, but when I actually started flying, I quickly realized there was a second unofficial training happening. The senior crew members would often contradict what we'd learned." "Can you give us specific examples?" Diana asked. "The safety checks," Elena replied immediately. "In training, we were taught to physically verify each life vest, oxygen mask, and emergency equipment. But on actual flights, the senior attendants would say, 'Just do a visual sweep. Don't waste time checking everything.' When I insisted on following the proper procedure, I was labeled as difficult and not a team player." "Were you aware this approach violated federal regulations?" Carlos asked gently. "Yes," Elena admitted. "But when I raised concerns, my direct supervisor told me, 'That's how training does it. This is how the real world works.' I was still on probation, so I felt pressured to conform." "Let's talk specifically about Flight AS847 yesterday," Diana said. "We understand there was an incident involving a passenger who was moved from first class to the last row." Elena's expression changed, a mixture of regret and resolve crossing her face. "Yes, that passenger was treated horribly. I knew it was wrong, but Morgan, Ms. Taylor, was the lead flight attendant. She has had 15 years with the company. I'm still on probation. Tell us what you observed, Carlos encouraged. Elena detailed everything: the passenger's calm demeanor, Morgan's hostile response, the threats to involve the captain. She described the unsecured cart during turbulence, the ignored call buttons, the rushed safety checks. With each revelation, the inspectors took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification, but never interrupting her flow. I tried to provide proper service whenever Morgan wasn't watching, Elena explained. I brought the passenger water from first class. I helped the elderly man to the lavatory when his call button was ignored. But I was afraid to directly challenge Morgan's authority. That's understandable given your position, Diana assured her. Did you notice anything about the passenger that seemed unusual? Elena thought for a moment. She was very observant. She seemed to be noticing and remembering everything. And she thanked me in a way that felt significant, like she understood more than she was saying. Carlos and Diana exchanged glances. The passenger was Dr. Gabrielle Reynolds, the director of the Federal Aviation Administration, Carlos explained. She was traveling incognito on personal business. Elena's eyes widened in shock. The FAA director. Oh my God. Her hand flew to her mouth. No wonder we're all being investigated. Dr. Reynolds specifically mentioned you in her report, Diana said, her tone softening. She noted your professionalism and your attempts to provide proper service despite the toxic environment. She observed that you were the only crew member who maintained appropriate standards. Elena blinked, rapidly processing this unexpected information. I was just doing my job the way I was trained to do it. That's exactly the point, Carlos said. You followed your training and your professional ethics despite pressure to do otherwise. That's not as common as it should be. The interview continued for another hour, with Elena providing detailed insights into the operational culture at Atlantic SkyLine. She described the unofficial hierarchies, the unwritten rules, the subtle and not-so-subtle pressures to prioritize speed over safety. She explained how new employees were quickly sorted into team players who adapted to the corrupted norms and by-the-books employees who were marginalized and often driven out. The worst part, she concluded, is that many of us joined Atlantic SkyLine because of its once great reputation. We wanted to be part of something excellent, but the reality was so different from what we expected. It feels like the whole company lost its way. As the interview concluded, Diana closed her notebook and fixed Elena with a direct gaze. Ms. Rodriguez, your testimony today has been invaluable. It's people like you, those who maintain their professional standards even under pressure, who will be essential to rebuilding this airline's safety culture. Will there still be an airline to rebuild? Elena asked, voicing the fear that had spread through the employee ranks. That depends largely on how the leadership responds to the consent order, Carlos replied honestly. But based on what we've seen today, Atlantic SkyLine has at least one essential ingredient for recovery: employees who remember what the standard should be and have the courage to maintain it. As Elena left the conference room, she felt a complex mixture of emotions: concern for her future relief at finally giving voice to her observations, and a cautious hope that perhaps this crisis might lead to the airline becoming what she had believed it to be when she joined. Unknown to her, her interview had already been flagged for special attention in the investigator's report. In the transformation that would follow, voices like hers would prove crucial to distinguishing between what should be preserved and what needed to be changed. Sometimes the most valuable insights came not from those at the top of an organization, but from those who still believed in what it was supposed to represent. News travels fast in the aviation industry, and by the end of the first day of inspections, executives at every major airline in the country were receiving urgent briefings about the situation unfolding at Atlantic SkyLine. Though the full details remained confidential, the scale and scope of the FAA's response had sent shockwaves through boardrooms and operations centers nationwide. At Global Airways headquarters in Chicago, CEO Daniel Parker convened an emergency meeting of his senior leadership team. The atmosphere was tense as they gathered around the conference table, all aware of the gravity of the situation they were discussing. "What do we know for certain?" Parker asked his regulatory affairs director. "The FAA has launched a director-level inquiry into Atlantic SkyLine, triggered by direct observations from Dr. Reynolds herself," the director reported. 20 inspectors hit their JFK and LAX operations simultaneously this morning. No advance notice. The word from my contacts is that it's the most aggressive regulatory action anyone's seen in years. And the cause, Parker pressed. Multiple safety violations observed personally by the FAA director while she was traveling incognito. Apparently, she was bumped from first class to a middle seat in the last row in what appears to have been a discriminatory action. From that vantage point, she witnessed numerous safety infractions. The implications hung heavily in the air. Everyone present understood the vulnerability of their own operations to similar scrutiny. "What are we doing about this?" Parker asked, looking around the table. "Because I guarantee you, if it's happening at Atlantic SkyLine, elements of it are happening here too. And I don't want to be sitting in this room 2 weeks from now having the same conversation about Global Airways." The chief safety officer cleared her throat. "We've already initiated an internal audit focused on the specific violations reported at Atlantic SkyLine. Unsecured equipment, falsified safety checks, improper emergency equipment. We're also reviewing our customer service protocols, particularly how seat assignments are managed." "That's reactive," Parker said, shaking his head. "We need to be proactive. I want every member of our executive team to take a flight this week, anonymously in economy, middle seats. I want you to experience what our passengers experience and observe how our crews actually operate when they don't know they're being watched." Similar scenes were playing out at airlines across the country. At Transcontinental, the safety team was already reviewing maintenance logs looking for patterns of abbreviated checks or procedural shortcuts. At Pacific Air, flight attendants were being called into refresher training on emergency procedures and equipment verification. The ripple effects extended beyond domestic carriers. International airlines with U.S. operations were equally concerned, knowing that their flights fell under the same FAA jurisdiction. "This is going to change the landscape," predicted aviation analyst Sophia Liu on a financial news network. "The Atlantic SkyLine investigation isn't just about one airline. It's a wake-up call for the entire industry. We're likely to see increased regulatory scrutiny, more rigorous enforcement, and potentially significant financial impacts as airlines rush to address issues before the FAA finds them." On social media, the story was beginning to break, though, still without the full details. The hashtag #Seat38B had started trending with passengers sharing their own experiences of discriminatory treatment on flights. While Atlantic SkyLine hadn't yet been officially named in these reports, the specifics were beginning to leak out through industry channels. Anyone in aviation leadership who isn't taking this extremely seriously is making a potentially fatal mistake, both for their career and possibly for their airline, warned a former FAA official in an industry publication. This isn't a routine inspection or a typical fine. This is the director herself initiating action based on personal observation. The message being sent couldn't be clearer. The standard is the standard, and it will be enforced. Perhaps most significantly, the investment community had begun to react. Atlantic SkyLine's stock had dropped 8% on rumors of regulatory issues, and analysts were issuing cautious guidance for the entire sector, warning of potential compliance costs and operational disruptions. By the evening of the first day of inspections, what had begun as one passenger's experience had transformed into an industry-wide moment of reckoning. Airlines that had gradually normalized corner cutting, that had allowed service standards to erode, that had created cultures where rule bending was accepted, were suddenly confronting the potential consequences of those choices. And in boardrooms across the country, the question on everyone's mind was the same. Could it happen here? The answer, uncomfortably often, was yes. The passenger in seat 38B had inadvertently initiated a transformation that would extend far beyond one airline, one flight or one instance of discrimination. She had reminded an entire industry that standards existed for a reason, that regulations weren't just bureaucratic obstacles, and that the culture of an organization, how it treated both its passengers and its employees, was inseparable from its commitment to safety. It was a lesson long overdue. And now, no one in the industry could claim they hadn't heard it. 3 weeks after the fateful flight AS847, Dr. Gabrielle Reynolds sat at her desk in Washington reviewing the final comprehensive report on Atlantic SkyLine Airlines. The document represented hundreds of hours of investigation interviews with dozens of employees and meticulous examination of years of operational records. At 273 pages, it was one of the most extensive airline safety investigations in FAA history, and its findings were as troubling as they were definitive. Thomas Wilson entered with 2 cups of coffee, placing one on Dr. Reynolds' desk. "Have you reached the conclusions section yet?" he asked. She nodded, her expression grave. "It's exactly what we suspected from the beginning. This wasn't about a few problematic employees or isolated incidents. This was about an organization that had gradually consistently abandoned its commitment to safety in pursuit of financial metrics." The report detailed a pattern of deterioration that had accelerated over the previous 3 years. Maintenance checks that were routinely abbreviated or falsified, safety equipment that wasn't properly inspected or replaced, training programs that emphasized speed over thoroughness, a reporting system that discouraged employees from documenting problems, a management structure that punished those who maintained standards, a customer service approach that explicitly discriminated based on appearance and perceived status. What had happened to Dr. Reynolds was not an anomaly. It was the predictable outcome of a culture that had lost its way. "The fine recommendation is $28 million, Thomas noted. "That's the largest in FAA history by a significant margin, and fully justified by the evidence," Dr. Reynolds replied. "But the financial penalty is only one element of the response. The consent order's structural requirements are far more significant for the long term." She turned to the final section of the report, which outlined the comprehensive remediation plan that Atlantic SkyLine would be required to implement immediate grounding of 40% of their fleet for comprehensive safety inspections, complete retraining of all flight crews and ground staff, installation of an independent safety oversight committee with real authority, implementation of an anonymous reporting system for safety concerns, with direct oversight from an FAA-appointed monitor, termination of all management personnel found to have suppressed safety reports, development of new customer service protocols explicitly prohibiting discrimination, regular unannounced FAA inspections for a minimum of 3 years. "It's the most comprehensive consent order we've ever issued," Thomas observed. "Do you think they can survive it?" Dr. Reynolds considered the question carefully. "That depends on whether they embrace it or resist it. The financial cost will be significant. Yes, but the real challenge is cultural. Can they rebuild an organization that genuinely prioritizes safety over expediency, that treats all passengers with dignity regardless of appearance, that values employees who maintain standards even when it's inconvenient?" She closed the report and sat back in her chair. The evidence suggests that Atlantic SkyLine still has good people like Elena Rodriguez, who maintain proper standards despite pressure to do otherwise. If leadership can recognize and elevate those voices, then yes, they can survive and potentially emerge stronger. And if they don't, Thomas asked, then they shouldn't be operating an airline. Dr. Reynolds replied simply, "The stakes are too high." The public announcement of the investigation's findings was scheduled for the following morning. The aviation industry, already buzzing with speculation, would finally learn the full extent of Atlantic SkyLine's failures and the unprecedented regulatory response they had triggered. But beyond the immediate impact on one airline, Dr. Reynolds knew that this case would send a message to the entire industry. It would establish a new benchmark for accountability, a clear demonstration that the FAA under her leadership would not tolerate the gradual erosion of safety standards or the normalization of discriminatory practices. There's one more thing, Thomas said, handing her a folder. Elena Rodriguez. You asked to be kept informed about her situation. Dr. Reynolds opened the folder to find that Atlantic SkyLine had promoted Elena to a new position in safety compliance, specifically citing her commitment to maintaining proper standards even under challenging circumstances. A small smile crossed Dr. Reynolds' face. At least they're recognizing the right people now. That's a start. As she prepared for the press conference that would announce the most significant airline safety enforcement action in decades, Dr. Reynolds reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple seat reassignment. What had started as a personal slight had revealed fundamental flaws in an organization entrusted with thousands of lives every day. The response had never been about retribution for how she was treated. It was about ensuring that every passenger on every flight could trust that their safety wasn't being compromised by corner-cutting, that the people responsible for their journey were upholding the standards they had promised to maintain. Sometimes the view from seat 38B revealed truths that couldn't be seen from the executive suite. And in this case, that uncomfortable middle seat in the last row had provided exactly the perspective needed to initiate long-overdue change. 6 months after Flight AS847, Dr. Gabrielle Reynolds stood at the window of her Washington office watching a distant Atlantic SkyLine aircraft climb into the clear autumn sky. Its ascent was smooth and deliberate, a visible metaphor for the airline's own painful but steady recovery. On her desk lay the latest quarterly compliance report from Atlantic SkyLine, a thick document detailing the airline's progress in implementing the consent order's requirements. She had just finished reviewing it with a sense of cautious optimism. They're actually doing it, Thomas observed from his seat at the conference table. When we issued that consent order, I half expected them to fight it, drag their feet, try to negotiate easier terms. They recognized it for what it was. Dr. Reynolds replied, not punishment, but a roadmap for becoming the airline they were supposed to be all along. The transformation of Atlantic SkyLine over the past 6 months had been remarkable, though not without significant cost and disruption. The initial grounding of 40% of their fleet had caused weeks of canceled flights and millions in lost revenue. The $28 million fine had forced painful financial restructuring. The mandatory retraining of all personnel had stretched their resources to the breaking point. But beneath these visible challenges, something more fundamental was changing. The airline's basic operating philosophy and culture. The safety metrics are the most encouraging, Dr. Reynolds noted, turning to a specific section of the report. Anonymous safety reporting is up 3 to 40%. That means employees trust the system now. They believe problems will actually be addressed. And customer complaints about discriminatory treatment are down 87%, Thomas added. The new service protocols seem to be working. The consent order had required Atlantic SkyLine to implement comprehensive new training on both safety procedures and customer treatment. Every employee from CEO to baggage handler had completed coursework specifically addressing unconscious bias and its impact on passenger interactions. More significantly, the airline had restructured its incentives and metrics. On-time performance was still measured, but it no longer outweighed safety considerations. Customer satisfaction was tracked not just in aggregate, but broken down by demographic categories to ensure all passengers received equal treatment. An independent safety oversight committee led by respected industry veterans with no ties to Atlantic SkyLine now had the authority to ground aircraft remove personnel and halt operations if standards weren't met. Their unannounced inspections had become a regular feature of the airline's operations, creating a culture where proper procedures were followed consistently, not just when official oversight was expected. What about the ripple effects to other airlines? Dr. Reynolds asked, turning away from the window. Thomas smiled slightly. That might be the most significant outcome of all. Every major carrier has initiated internal safety culture audits. We're seeing voluntary reporting of issues that would have been hidden 6 months ago. The industry got the message. We're serious about enforcing standards. The Atlantic SkyLine case had indeed transformed the regulatory landscape. Airlines that had gradually normalized corner cutting were rushing to address issues before they attracted FAA attention. Industry associations had developed new best practices for safety compliance and non-discriminatory customer service. Even international carriers had taken note, with several foreign aviation authorities launching similar initiatives based on the FAA's approach. And the Transparent Skies initiative, Dr. Reynolds inquired, referring to the industry-wide program she had launched in the wake of the Atlantic SkyLine investigation. Exceeding expectations, Thomas reported. 17 airlines are now publishing their safety compliance data and customer service metrics, quarterly broken down by demographic categories. The transparency is creating natural competitive pressure to improve. Dr. Reynolds nodded with satisfaction. The Transparent Skies initiative had been her way of expanding the impact of the Atlantic SkyLine case, encouraging airlines to voluntarily adopt many of the same reforms that had been mandated in the consent order. By making safety and service data public, it allowed passengers to make informed choices and created market incentives for continuous improvement. And Atlantic SkyLine itself. Will they survive financially? She asked. Their stock price is still down 22% from pre-investigation levels, but it's recovered significantly from the bottom, Thomas replied. Bookings are gradually returning. They've actually started using their compliance with the consent order as a marketing advantage, the new Atlantic SkyLine setting higher standards. It seems to be resonating with passengers. Dr. Reynolds returned to her desk and closed the report. The transformation wasn't complete, and vigilance would be required to ensure the changes became permanent rather than temporary responses to regulatory pressure. But the evidence suggested that Atlantic SkyLine was genuinely evolving into an organization that prioritized the right values and rewarded the right behaviors. Sometimes, she reflected, the greatest favor you can do for an organization is to hold it accountable before its failures lead to tragedy. Atlantic SkyLine was heading down a path that has led other airlines to disasters. This intervention, painful as it was, may have prevented something far worse. Thomas nodded in agreement. And all because they put the wrong passenger in seat 38B. Dr. Reynolds smiled slightly. Not the wrong passenger, Thomas. Just the one who could see clearly from that vantage point. Outside her window, the Atlantic SkyLine aircraft was now just a distant silver speck against the blue sky, carrying hundreds of passengers who would never know how their safety had been enhanced by what had happened on one flight 6 months earlier. And that Dr. Reynolds reflected was exactly as it should be. The Atlantic SkyLine investigation had transformed not just an airline but the lives of everyone involved in the fateful flight AS847. As public attention shifted to the institutional reforms, the individual players in the drama were navigating their own reckonings with what had occurred. Allison Peterson sat nervously in the reception area of a corporate consulting firm specializing in aviation customer service. 6 months after her termination from Atlantic SkyLine, she was interviewing for a position she never could have imagined pursuing, teaching airline employees how to avoid the very mistakes she had made. The journey to this point had been painful. After losing her job, she had initially retreated into anger and denial, blaming Dr. Reynolds' Atlantic SkyLine and anyone but herself for the consequences of her actions. The criminal investigation into her arrangement with Richard Whitman had resulted in probation rather than jail time, but the experience of being processed through the legal system had been humiliating and frightening. The turning point came 3 months after her termination, when she was approached by an aviation industry consultant who offered an unexpected perspective. "Your experience has value," he had told her. "You understand better than most how bias operates in customer service environments, how unofficial practices become normalized, how good people can justify discriminatory actions. If you're willing to own your mistakes and help others learn from them, there's a path forward." Skeptical but desperate, Allison had agreed to work with him to develop a case study based on her experiences. The process of analyzing and articulating exactly what had happened and why, had forced her to confront the flawed thinking that had led to her catastrophic decision. Now, as she waited to be called for her interview, she reviewed the presentation she had prepared. It was titled, "From Gate Agent to Cautionary Tale, How I Learned the True Cost of Bias." It was honest, unflinching, and reflective, qualities that the old Allison would have dismissed as weaknesses, but that she now recognized as essential to genuine professional growth. The receptionist looked up. "They're ready for you, Ms. Peterson." Across the country, Morgan Taylor's path had been more difficult. Unlike Allison, she had refused to acknowledge her responsibility for the safety violations on Flight AS847. Her 15 years of experience had hardened into a defensive shell of entitlement and self-justification. The months following her termination had been marked by bitter social media posts blaming Atlantic SkyLine for making her a scapegoat attempting to sue the airline for wrongful termination, a case quickly dismissed by the courts and alienating former colleagues with her persistent denial of wrongdoing. But reality had a way of breaking through even the strongest defenses. No airline would hire a flight attendant with her record. Her financial resources were dwindling. And in quiet moments, the truth she refused to publicly acknowledge began to seep into her consciousness. She had violated fundamental safety protocols and treated passengers with contempt rather than care. Today, she sat in a community college classroom enrolled in an aircraft maintenance technology program. It wasn't the career she had envisioned, but it offered a path back into aviation that didn't require customer interaction. More importantly, it provided rigorous training in the critical importance of following established procedures, a lesson she had learned too late in her previous role. As the instructor discussed the FAA regulations governing maintenance documentation, Morgan took meticulous notes. She still had a long way to go in rebuilding her professional identity, but she had taken the first tentative steps toward a future defined by accountability rather than evasion. Richard Whitman, the passenger who had occupied Dr. Reynolds' seat 2A, had faced his own consequences. His arrangement with Allison Peterson had been exposed during the investigation, resulting in his termination from Atlas Financial and a lifetime ban from Atlantic SkyLine. More significantly, the publicity surrounding his role in the scandal had made him a pariah in business circles, his name forever associated with entitlement and corruption. Like Allison, he had eventually found a path to redemption through acknowledging his wrongdoing. He now ran a small ethics consulting practice, using his experience as a case study in how privilege could corrupt judgment and lead to catastrophic professional missteps. The executive leadership of Atlantic SkyLine had experienced varying fates. David Lawrence, who had been the face of the airline's initial response to Dr. Reynolds, had resigned 3 months into the consent order implementation. The pressure of managing the crisis, combined with his own recognition of his failure to address the cultural issues earlier, had led to his decision to step away. CEO Victoria Blackwell had initially resisted stepping down, arguing that she should lead the airline through its transformation. But as the extent of the organizational failures became clear, and particularly the evidence that concerns had been raised to her office and ignored her position became untenable. She resigned 4 months after the investigation, though she continued to defend her leadership in industry publications and interviews. The most surprising transformation might have been that of Martin Cooper, the former safety officer who had warned about cultural problems even before the investigation. Initially expected to be among those held accountable for the safety lapses, he had instead emerged as a key ally in the reform effort. His detailed knowledge of where and how corners had been cut, combined with his genuine commitment to fixing the problems, had made him invaluable to the FAA oversight team. He now served as the airline's chief compliance officer, reporting directly to the new CEO and the independent safety committee. His office door displayed a small plaque with a simple message: "Standard is standard." It had become something of a mantra within the reformed Atlantic SkyLine. A reminder that procedures existed for a reason and that no operational pressure justified compromising them. These individual journeys, some toward redemption, others toward continued denial, all irrevocably altered by the events of Flight AS847, illustrated an essential truth about organizational culture. Institutions were ultimately collections of people making countless daily choices. The failure or success of any reform effort depended not just on new policies or oversight mechanisms, but on whether individuals chose to embrace or resist the values those structures were designed to enforce. The passenger in seat 38B had set in motion not just institutional change, but profound personal reckonings that would continue long after the headlines faded and the formal investigation concluded. On a bright spring morning, Elena Rodriguez walked confidently through the renovated training center at Atlantic SkyLine's headquarters. The facility had been completely redesigned as part of the airline's reform efforts with state-of-the-art simulation equipment, spacious classrooms, and a central atrium dominated by a simple but powerful motto, etched in glass: safety first. Service always. Standards matter. As the newly appointed Director of Service Quality and Safety Culture, Elena now oversaw the training of all customer-facing personnel. Her rise through the organization over the past 6 months had been meteoric, but well-deserved, a testament to both her professional capabilities and the airline's commitment to elevating employees who embodied the values they were now working to instill throughout the company. "Good morning," Ms. Rodriguez called a security guard as she passed through the main entrance. "Big day today, isn't it?" Elena smiled and nodded. "The biggest. Our first graduating class under the new program. Today marked a significant milestone in Atlantic SkyLine's transformation. The first cohort of flight attendants trained entirely under the reformed curriculum would be receiving their wings. These new crew members had never known the old culture. They had been immersed from day one in the airline's renewed commitment to safety service and accountability. As Elena reviewed her notes for the graduation address, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this position. 6 months ago, she had been a junior flight attendant still on probation, trying to maintain proper standards in an environment that often punished such efforts. Now she was helping to shape the future of the entire airline. The turning point had come 3 weeks after the FAA investigation began. Elena had been called to a meeting with the interim CEO and several executives from the transition team. Nervous and uncertain, she had arrived expecting perhaps a follow-up to her testimony about Flight AS847. Instead, she had been offered an opportunity that took her breath away. "We've been reviewing the FAA reports," the interim CEO had explained. "Your name comes up repeatedly as someone who maintained proper standards despite significant pressure to do otherwise. That's exactly the kind of leadership we need as we rebuild this airline's culture." They had offered her a position on the safety culture reform team with a clear path to advancement if she proved as capable as they believed. It was a risk for them, elevating a 6-month employee over many more senior staff, and an even bigger risk for Elena, who would be scrutinized from all sides as she stepped into a visible role. But she had accepted without hesitation, driven by the same commitment to proper standards that had guided her actions on Flight AS847. The months since had been challenging but deeply rewarding. She had helped design new training protocols that emphasized the why behind safety procedures, not just the what. She had developed assessment tools that evaluated not just technical knowledge, but judgment and decision-making. And perhaps most significantly, she had created a mentorship program that paired new employees with veterans who exemplified the airline's reformed values. As she entered the auditorium where the graduation ceremony would take place, Elena noticed a distinguished visitor sitting quietly in the back row. Dr. Gabrielle Reynolds had accepted her invitation to attend, though she had requested no formal acknowledgement or role in the proceedings. Elena approached her with a respectful smile. "Director Reynolds, thank you for coming. I know how busy you are." Dr. Reynolds returned the smile. "I wouldn't have missed it, Ms. Rodriguez. This is an important day for Atlantic SkyLine. And for the industry," Elena added. "Many of the programs we've developed here are being adopted by other airlines. Your vision is spreading far beyond one company." Dr. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. That's the true measure of impact. Not just fixing one organization, but elevating standards across an entire industry. She gestured to the gathering graduates. These young people will carry those higher standards throughout their careers, whether they remain with Atlantic SkyLine or move elsewhere. The conversation was interrupted as the ceremony coordinator signaled that it was time to begin. Elena excused herself to take her place on stage, but not before Dr. Reynolds offered one last observation. "You know, Ms. Rodriguez, when I noticed your actions on Flight AS847, I saw someone who remembered what this industry is supposed to be about, the sacred trust passengers place in us to prioritize their safety and dignity. In my experience, organizations are transformed not by grand strategies or dramatic restructuring, but by elevating voices like yours that never forgot the standard even when others abandoned it." Elena absorbed these words as she walked to the podium, looking out at the faces of the graduating class, eager, committed, untainted by the compromised culture that had led to Atlantic SkyLine's crisis. She felt a profound sense of responsibility and hope. This was how lasting change happened, not all at once in a dramatic moment, but gradually through the consistent choices of individuals committed to doing things the right way, even when no one seemed to be watching. As she began her address, Elena glanced once more toward Dr. Reynolds, the passenger from seat 38B whose observation had initiated this transformation. Their brief eye contact communicated a shared understanding that transcended words. Sometimes the most powerful action wasn't creating something new, but simply upholding what should have been the standard all along. 1 year to the day after Flight AS847, the aviation industry gathered in Washington, D.C. for the first annual Transparent Skies Summit. What had begun as a regulatory action against one airline had evolved into a transformative movement that was reshaping how airlines approached safety service and organizational culture. The grand ballroom of the Capitol Horizon Hotel was filled with executives from every major carrier, regulatory officials from a dozen countries, and industry experts eager to discuss the new paradigm that had emerged in the wake of what was now commonly called the 38B standard. Dr. Gabrielle Reynolds stood at the podium surveying the assembled leaders. Her opening address would set the tone for 2 days of workshops, panels, and strategic sessions, all focused on a single theme: maintaining the highest standards of safety and dignity in aviation operations. 1 year ago, she began a series of events that began with a seat reassignment revealed fundamental flaws in how one airline, and by extension many airlines, had come to operate. What we discovered wasn't just individual misconduct or isolated lapses. It was evidence of a gradual, almost imperceptible erosion of the standards that keep our skies safe and our passengers respected. The room was silent, executives from dozens of airlines reflecting on how the Atlantic SkyLine case had forced them to examine their own operations. The easy response would have been simple punishment: fines, terminations, public censure. But that would have addressed symptoms rather than causes. Instead, we chose a different path. We asked a more difficult question. How do we transform not just one airline, but an industry's approach to its fundamental responsibilities? She gestured to the digital display behind her, which showed real-time safety and service compliance data from the 17 airlines that had joined the Transparent Skies initiative. The metrics were impressive. Dramatic improvements across every measure of operational integrity and customer experience. The results speak for themselves. Voluntary safety reporting up 218% across participating carriers. Maintenance compliance issues down 76%. Customer complaints regarding discriminatory treatment reduced by 62%. And most importantly, a measurable improvement in the key indicators that predict serious safety incidents. Dr. Reynolds paused, making eye contact with representatives from Atlantic SkyLine who sat together in the front row. Their new CEO, James Harrington, nodded in acknowledgement of how far they had come. Atlantic SkyLine's journey from crisis to industry leader demonstrates that genuine reform is possible even after the most serious failures. Their willingness to embrace transparency, accountability, and a fundamental re-examination of their culture has not only saved their airline, but established a new benchmark for operational excellence. The statistics supported this assessment. After an initial period of financial struggle and public skepticism, Atlantic SkyLine had rebounded dramatically. Their stock had recovered to 92% of its pre-investigation value. Bookings had returned to pre-crisis levels. Most significantly, they now led the industry in safety compliance metrics and customer satisfaction scores. But the true legacy of what began in Seat 38B extends far beyond one airline, Dr. Reynolds continued. It has catalyzed a fundamental reassessment of how we measure success in aviation. She outlined the key elements of this new approach. Safety not as a cost center, but as a core business value. Service standards applied equally to all passengers regardless of status. Transparency and operational metrics, accessible to regulators and the public. Employee input valued and protected, particularly regarding safety concerns. Consequences for violations consistently applied regardless of rank. These principles are now being adopted not just in the United States, but globally. Aviation authorities from Europe, Asia, and Africa have implemented similar frameworks. What began as an American regulatory response has become an international movement toward a more accountable, transparent, and ultimately safer global aviation system. As Dr. Reynolds concluded her address and the summit transitioned to its first panel discussion, the conversation in the room reflected a genuine shift in industry thinking. Executives who had initially viewed the Atlantic SkyLine case with defensive concern. Could this happen to us? Were now engaging with it as a model for proactive improvement. How can we apply these lessons before we face a similar crisis? The case had become required study in aviation management programs worldwide. The view from 38B was now standard reading for flight crews, gate agents, and executives alike. A powerful reminder that how an organization treated its least powerful customers revealed crucial truths about its underlying values and operational integrity. Perhaps most significantly, the incident had permanently altered the relationship between airlines and their regulators. The FAA's willingness to impose comprehensive reform, rather than just financial penalties, had demonstrated that meaningful accountability was possible. Other regulatory agencies had followed suit, creating a new global standard for aviation oversight. As the discussions continued throughout the day, it became increasingly clear that the legacy of Flight AS847 would extend far beyond the careers of those directly involved. It had become a defining moment in aviation history, not because of what went wrong, but because of how those failures had been transformed into a catalyst for industry-wide improvement. The passenger from Seat 38B had changed not just one flight or one airline, but an entire approach to the sacred responsibility of carrying millions of lives safely through the skies each day. And in that transformation lay the true measure of Dr. Gabrielle Reynolds' impact, not in the punishment she could have imposed, but in the standards she had helped to elevate across an industry that touched countless lives every day. The story of Seat 38B reminds us of a fundamental truth about power, dignity, and accountability. True power doesn't announce itself. It observes quietly until the moment of truth arrives. Dignity isn't something that can be taken from you. It's something you carry even in the most uncomfortable middle seat in the last row. And the measure of justice isn't in how quickly it arrives, but in how thoroughly it transforms. Dr. Gabrielle Reynolds never sought to punish Atlantic SkyLine for how she was treated. She sought to ensure that an airline entrusted with thousands of lives embraced the responsibility that trust demanded. In doing so, she created a legacy far more significant than any regulatory action. She helped establish a new standard that continues to protect passengers and crew members alike, whether they know her name or not. The next time you board a flight and notice the careful inspection of safety equipment, the respectful treatment of all passengers, regardless of appearance, or the attentive response to call buttons, Know that you're experiencing in part the enduring impact of what happened when the wrong passenger was demoted to the right seat. Where are you watching from? Have you ever experienced discrimination while traveling? Or have you witnessed someone standing firm in their professional standards, even when pressured to do otherwise? Share your story in the comments below. If this account of quiet dignity and powerful accountability resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of the impact one person's principled stand can have on systems much larger than themselves. Remember that in a world that often celebrates the loudest voices, it's sometimes the quiet, observant ones who create the most profound and lasting change.